I speak 10 languages, the housemaid said, and the millionaire's heir laughed so hard the sound bounced off the library walls. Before that morning was over, the same woman he was trying to shame would be the only person standing between the Hale family and disaster. And if she failed, she would be thrown out of the estate with nothing. That was the cruelty of it. Sebastian Hale did not just want to embarrass Dalia Novak. He wanted an audience. The Hale estate had been restless since dawn. Footsteps clipped across polished floors, silver trays chimed in the pantry, and somewhere down the east corridor, a maid dropped a stack of pressed linen and gasped as if she'd broken crystal. Everyone knew something important was coming. A foreign shipping consortium was due before lunch, and the old family fortune, already fraying around the edges, was tied to the contract they were bringing. The orchards were underperforming. The docks the Hales partly owned needed repairs. Staff had gone unpaid twice that spring, though no one said it loudly. Even the air inside the house felt tight, full of beeswax, old paper, and that metallic edge that comes before bad news. Dalia was in the library because that was where she was always sent when guests mattered most. She was trusted to clean the delicate rooms nobody else bothered to understand. She moved carefully along the walnut shelves with a soft cloth in one hand and a feather duster in the other, lifting crystal decanters, setting them down without a click, turning imported bottles so their labels faced outward. Her uniform was plain, her sleeves rolled once at the wrist, her dark hair pinned so neatly it looked severe from a distance. Most people in the house saw only that. A maid, quiet, efficient, forgettable. Sebastian came in with the kind of energy that made servants straighten before he spoke. He was young, handsome in the polished way expensive men often are, and he wore impatience like a title. 2 junior clerks followed him, then the butler, then one of the cooks lingering in the doorway. Because wherever Sebastian stopped, people tended to gather. He had inherited his father's chin and none of his father's caution. In one hand, he held a folder thick with contract papers. In the other, a glass he wasn't supposed to be drinking from before noon. He watched Dalia turn one green bottle toward the light. "Well," he said, "you're studying that label as if it owes you an answer." She looked up once. "I'm dusting it, sir." No. He stepped closer, amused now. "You paused, which means either you can read it or you're pretending you can." A nervous little silence opened behind him. The butler looked at the rug. One clerk smiled too quickly, just to stay safe. Sebastian tapped the bottle with one finger. "I'll make this easy. Read it, out loud." Dalia set the cloth over her wrist. "There's no need." That's usually what people say when there's every need. He turned, making sure the others could hear. "Come on then, surprise us." The label was in a language Sebastian didn't know. That was the point. He had chosen the shelf because it made him feel worldly, all those imported bottles lined up like proof of breeding, and he was certain the maid who polished them every week could no more read them than she could buy them. Dalia's face did not change. That, more than anything, irritated him. "You think I can't?" she asked. Sebastian gave a short laugh. "I think you dust things. Let's not dress it up." A maid from the hallway stopped with a basket in her arms. A footman froze near the door. Even Mrs. Fenn, the housekeeper, had appeared at the threshold, her mouth tightening as she took in the scene. Then Dalia did something small and dangerous. She folded the cloth once, very neatly, and placed it on the side table as if she had all the time in the world. "I can read that label," she said, "and the others beside it. I can read the freight notices in your study, too, the old shipping ledgers in the office, and the notes your guests leave when they think the staff won't understand them. I speak 10 languages. There it was. The room went still in a deeper way than that. Even the crackle from the fireplace seemed to pull back. Sebastian stared at her for half a beat, then barked out a laugh so loud one of the clerks actually flinched. 10? Yes. 10 languages, he repeated, turning to the others as though she had handed him the morning's best entertainment. Our housemaid. Of course she does. He walked to the shelf, pulled down another bottle, squinted at its label, and shoved it toward her without even checking which language it was. Go on, then. Read this one. And if you're lying, if this is some little performance to make yourself seem important, you'll be out by noon. No references, no wages beyond the week. Are we clear? Mrs. Fenn took a step forward. Master Sebastian. No, she made the claim, she proves it. Dalia's fingers closed around the bottle. The glass was cool. The paper label was faintly rough beneath her thumb. She glanced at the words once, then lifted her eyes to his. What if I do prove it? She asked quietly. Sebastian opened his mouth to answer, but before a sound came out, the library doors flew open so hard they struck the wall. The estate steward stood there breathless, pale, and sweating through his collar. Sir, he said to Sebastian, then to the room at large, the delegation has arrived early, and the interpreter is gone. If this kind of story grabs you, leave a like and stay with me, because the next few minutes will change Dalia Novak's life. For one strange second, nobody moved. The steward stood in the doorway, gulping air, one hand still braced against the panel as if he had run the full length of the house. His face had gone the color of flour. There was sweat darkening the collar of his jacket, and his breath carried the sharp smell of cold, outdoor air and horse leather from the drive. Behind him, somewhere beyond the corridor, front doors were opening and closing, boots were striking stone, carriage trunks were being unloaded too fast. The visitors were already here. Sebastian recovered first. Gone? He snapped. What do you mean, gone? I mean he's not in his room, sir. His case is missing. So is the portfolio he brought for the final review. Cook says he didn't come down for breakfast, and Arthur checked the side path. There are wheel marks near the lower gate. The folder in Sebastian's hand bent under his grip. Find him. We are trying. Trying? His voice cracked like a whip in that quiet room. By the time you finish trying, they'll be seated in my father's drawing room. Mrs. Fenn looked from the steward to Dalia and back again. She was a practical woman, never dramatic, but her fingers tightened around the basket she still carried. The butler cleared his throat softly and said, Sir, the delegation cannot be left unattended. Mr. Hale is waiting in the blue salon. That name changed the air. Edmund Hale, old now, thinner than the portraits in the gallery, had spent the last month keeping himself upright through sheer will and tea strong enough to stain porcelain. Everyone in the house knew he was holding on for this one agreement. If the consortium signed, the estate could breathe. If they walked away, half the servants already feared autumn would bring dismissals. Sebastian muttered something under his breath, ugly and low. Then his eyes landed on Dalia again. She was still holding the bottle. In another moment, maybe in another life, he would have gone on mocking her. Pride would have demanded it. But panic is a cruel editor. It cuts a man fast. He looked at the steward, then at the open doorway, then back at the woman he had just threatened to throw out before noon. Mrs. Fenn spoke before he could. She can help. Sebastian turned sharply. This is business, not parlor entertainment. No, said the housekeeper, and now her voice had steel in it. This is the exact reason you should stop treating it like entertainment. The words hit harder than a slap because they were true, and several people in the room knew it. Dalia set the bottle back on the shelf with exquisite care. Who's in the delegation? The steward answered at once, grateful for a practical question. 4 principals, 1 legal advisor, 1 logistics director. They correspond in different languages depending on the topic, and the draft notes from this week were prepared in more than one version. That made Dalia's eyes narrow, just slightly. Originals or summaries? The steward hesitated. Sebastian saw it too. What does that mean? It means, Dalia said, looking at the steward rather than at him, that if the man you hired was working from summaries, this house may already be speaking about 2 different contracts. The room went colder. Sebastian gave a disbelieving laugh, but it had no ease in it now. You're making this sound like espionage. No, she said quietly, just carelessness. Carelessness gets expensive when people assume the staff sees less than they do. That landed in the center of him. He hated that she had managed to sound calm while he felt the ground moving under his feet. A bell rang somewhere downstairs. Once. Twice. The signal for arriving guests being shown in. The steward swallowed. "They're in the hall, sir." Another voice came, faint from the corridor, but unmistakable. Edmund Hale. Thin, worn, impatient. "Sebastian, why are they waiting?" Sebastian strode to the door, then stopped. He did not want witnesses to what came next, but he had too many already. His jaw flexed. The whole room watched him wrestle with the humiliation of needing the very woman he had decided to crush. Finally, he said, without looking at her, "If this is some trick—" "It isn't," Mrs. Fenn cut in. He ignored her. "If you step into that room and fail, you will do more than embarrass yourself. You could wreck this family." Dalia's answer came without heat. "If I step into that room and succeed, will you still call me illiterate?" He faced her then, properly this time. There are moments when a house seems to listen. This was one of them. The library, the corridor, the stairs beyond, the servants pretending not to stare, the clerks wishing they were invisible, the steward breathing through his mouth, all of it seemed to hold still around that question. Before Sebastian could answer, Edmund appeared at the far end of the passage in a dark robe under his day coat, one hand on a cane, the other braced against the wall paneling. He looked older up close than anyone liked to admit. His skin had that gray cast of a man running on determination alone, and yet his eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. "What is this delay?" he demanded. No one spoke at first. Mrs. Fenn did what none of the others had the courage to do. She stepped forward and said, "Sir, the interpreter has disappeared, but Dalia says she can manage the meeting." Edmund's gaze moved to the maid. "Manage it how?" "She speaks 10 languages, said Sebastian, and even now he made it sound impossible, almost offensive. Edmund studied her for a long beat. Dalia did not lower her eyes. At last he said, "Do you?" "Yes, sir." "And can you read legal papers as well as bottle labels?" A lesser person would have flinched at that. She didn't. "Well enough to know I would need the original documents in the room." The old man drew a careful breath. A clock ticked somewhere behind them. Downstairs, faint through the floor, came the low murmur of guests beginning to wonder why no one had joined them. Edmund gave the order that changed everything. "Bring the originals," he said, "and bring her." Sebastian opened his mouth to object, but his father turned that worn, piercing stare on him. "If she saves this meeting," Edmund said, "you will stand there and watch every word." And when they reached the drawing room doors a moment later, with silver handles cold under the butler's hand and foreign voices waiting on the other side, Dalia heard something that made her pulse jump for the first time that morning. One of the delegates was already arguing in a language Sebastian didn't even recognize. The sound reached her before the faces did. It came through the crack of the drawing room doors in quick, clipped bursts, then a slower reply, then another voice cutting across both of them with the flat impatience of someone who had already lost faith in the meeting. Dalia knew that rhythm. It was business under strain. When the butler opened the doors, warm air rushed over them carrying the smell of strong coffee, damp wool, cigar smoke, and polished oak. 6 guests stood near the long windows in the map table, travel coats draped over chairbacks, leather cases half open, papers already spread out like small white battlefields. Sebastian entered first because pride still needed a costume, even now. Edmund came a pace behind, leaning on his cane but holding himself straight. Dalia followed with the steward and the butler, aware of every eye that swung toward her and then away again in confusion. The guests had expected a late host, perhaps an apology, perhaps a replacement interpreter. They had not expected a housemaid in a plain, dark dress standing beside the family as if she belonged in the conversation. The man who had been speaking stopped at once. He was broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, with reins still darkening the hem of his coat. He glanced at Sebastian, then at Edmund, then at Dalia, and said something sharp in a language the younger Hale could not place. Another delegate, a woman with a narrow leather notebook tucked under her arm, answered him under her breath. The legal advisor said nothing, but he closed one file and opened another. Dalia listened for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then she turned slightly toward Edmund and spoke in a low voice. He says they were promised a final signing session with a competent interpreter, and he wants to know why he's being kept waiting by a household that still cannot decide who is in charge. Sebastian's face changed first. Then the visitors did. The silver-haired man stared at her. You understood that? She answered him in his own language, clear and even. The room froze around the syllables. He blinked once, slow as a man checking whether he had misheard. Then she shifted to the woman beside him and answered the comment she had muttered a moment earlier. That earned a sharper reaction. The woman straightened, notebook forgotten in her hand. Now every person in that room was looking at Dalia Novak, and the strange thing was this. For the first time that morning, she did not seem like the smallest person there. Sebastian tried to seize control again. Miss Novak will assist until the interpreter is found. Dalia did not look at him. I'll assist if the original documents are used. The legal advisor's head came up at once. Why would you ask that? Because I was told there are summaries, she said, now back in English. And because summaries can smooth over meanings that contracts are built on. The silence after that was different from the earlier one in the library. That had been mockery waiting for a joke. This was calculation. The delegates were no longer wondering whether she was pretending. They were measuring what it meant if she was not. Sebastian gave a strained little laugh. This is turning theatrical. No, said Edmund, his voice thin but firm. It is turning careful. Bring the originals. The steward moved at once, grateful to have a command. He crossed to the side cabinet where the estate's red-ribbon folders had been placed earlier that morning. At the same time, the legal advisor from the visiting party drew a dark blue folio from his own case and laid it on the table with deliberate care. The soft slap of paper on wood seemed loud in the room. Dalia stepped closer. She could feel the smooth edge of the map table against her fingertips and the weight of Sebastian's stare burning into the side of her face. Somewhere behind her, Mrs. Fenn had slipped quietly into the room with a tray no one touched. Even the teaspoon sat still. The silver-haired delegate gave her a testing look. Before we proceed, I'd like to know who exactly you are. There it was, not her name, her place. She answered simply, I work in the house. As staff? Yes. Sebastian shifted, embarrassed now in a way anger could not hide. She's one of the maids. A flicker passed across several faces. Surprise, then curiosity. Then something more useful than either of those. Respect that had not been there 30 seconds earlier. The woman with the notebook spoke next, this time in another language entirely, faster, more technical. She asked whether Dalia could follow maritime terms, insurance wording, and cross-border liability notes, or whether her skill ended at social niceties. It was a challenge, quiet but unmistakable. Dalia answered in the same language without hurrying. She corrected one of the speaker's terms with such gentle precision that the woman actually smiled despite herself. Then Dalia translated the whole exchange back into English for Edmund, word for word, including the part that had been meant to test her. Sebastian said nothing. The steward returned with the red ribbon file and placed it in front of Edmund. The old man pushed it toward Dalia. Open it. She did. Inside were the estate copies, neatly stacked, each page smelling faintly of fresh ink and sealing wax. Across from them, the visitors had their own originals, marked in pencil and tabbed with colored slips. Dalia noticed that at once. People who mark carefully are people who expect trouble. Her fingers moved through the first pages, checking titles, signatures, annex references. Then she stopped. Only for a breath. Only long enough for the legal advisor to notice. What is it? Edmund asked. Dalia touched the heading on the second document. Then the fourth page of the summary clipped behind it. Her voice stayed level, but something had hardened underneath it. "This opening section," she said, "doesn't match the summary language your office prepared last night." Sebastian frowned. "Meaning?" She lifted one page, then another. "Meaning someone has already changed the shape of this deal before anyone has signed it, and I need to know who wrote this version." For a moment, the only sound in the drawing room was the faint tap of rain against the long window panes. Sebastian gave a sharp, impatient exhale. "This is absurd. You're looking at drafts, not scripture. Minor wording shifts happen." Dalia kept one finger on the page. "Not like this." The legal advisor from the consortium stepped closer at once. He was a dry, narrow man with pale lashes and the kind of stillness that made other people rush their words. He adjusted his spectacles, leaned over the documents, and said, "Show me." She did not hand him the summary first. She placed the original beside it, lined up the paragraphs, and turned both pages so he could see them without twisting his neck. The smell of paper and sealing wax rose between them. On the estate version, one phrase described oversight of shipping revenue. In the summary, the same phrase had been softened into administrative convenience, the sort of wording busy people skim and trust. But Dalia knew better. In one language, a single gentle word could move power from one hand to another without raising its voice. She translated the passage aloud for Edmund first, then for the delegates in their own tongue. "In the original," she said, "the estate retains direct authority over freight income and route approval. In the summary, that becomes delegated management under a holding structure to be finalized later." The silver-haired delegate's expression hardened. "That is not a small difference." "No," she said. "It changes who controls the money before the orchard shipments even begin." Sebastian stepped forward. "Who prepared the summary?" The steward looked sick. "It came through the office late last night with the interpreter's notes, sir. Mr. Cross reviewed it with you in the West Study." At the name, Sebastian went still. Adrian Cross was not family. He was the sort of man who attached himself to family wealth and called it strategy. He handled side investments for Sebastian, spoke in polished numbers, wore expensive ties that never seemed to crease, and had spent the last 6 months drifting through the estate as if he'd already bought a wing of it in his head. He was supposed to arrive later for the signing. Now the mention of him changed the room in a different way. Edmund lifted his chin. "Was Adrian involved in the preparation of these papers?" Sebastian answered too fast. "He looked them over, that's all. He has business experience." Dalia turned another page. "Then his eyes should have caught this." She tapped a second section farther down, this one buried under cargo liability language and weather delay terms. Most people in the room would have taken one glance and moved on. She read it silently, lips still, then translated the heading into English, then into the delegate's language, then back again to prove she had not misheard herself. The rhythm of it was unnerving, almost surgical. The woman with the notebook stepped beside the legal advisor. "Read the next line." Dalia did. This time the problem was worse. The original version said that in the event of a dispute, arbitration would protect all currently named family beneficiaries until resolution. The summary version tightened the wording and replaced that protection with a phrase applying only to active managing signatories. To someone outside the family, that might sound harmless. Inside this house, it was a knife hidden in a glove. Edmund's grip tightened on his cane. Who is excluded by that wording? Dalia's eyes moved once over the names in the annex list. She did not answer at first, and that brief pause drew everyone taut. Then, very carefully, she said, "Your sister." It landed like a dropped glass. From the far side of the room came the faintest intake of breath. Aunt Beatrice had been sitting near the fire the whole time, half shadowed by the wing chair and the high back of the sofa. Dalia had noticed her when they entered, a small woman wrapped in a pale shawl, thin wrists, watchful eyes. Frail, yes, but not absent. The family had simply gotten used to speaking around her, which is its own kind of cruelty. Beatrice stared at Dalia as if the words had taken time to reach her. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Would you say that again?" Dalia turned to her, and her voice gentled. "If this summary were used as the basis for the final signing, your protection would disappear if there were a dispute over control. You would no longer count as a secured beneficiary under the family terms." Sebastian swung toward the chair. "That can't be right." "It is right," said the legal advisor, already checking the line himself. His face had gone flat with alarm. "Miss Novak is correct. This wording narrows the protected category." Beatrice's hand moved to her throat. Her rings clicked lightly against the chain she wore there. "Edmund." The old man shut his eyes for one brief second, then opened them with something raw and dangerous in them. "Who drafted this summary?" No one answered. The rain seemed louder now. Somewhere in the corridor, a footman shifted his weight and then froze again when he realized he could be heard. Sebastian looked at the page, then at Dalia, then at the steward. "Bring every version from the office, every marked copy, and send someone for Adrian." The steward hesitated. "He's not in the house, sir." Sebastian's head snapped up. "What do you mean, not in the house?" "I was told he left the East Drive before the delegation arrived. He said he had to collect a revised customs schedule from the village office." That excuse hung in the air for half a second before Dalia spoke. "No," she said, eyes still on the papers. "If he left before the visitors came, then he already knew this version would be questioned." The silver-haired delegate folded his arms. "On what basis do you say that?" Dalia slid out one more page from the red ribbon file, one the others had not yet noticed. A thin annex, easy to miss, easy to misuse. She ran her finger under a line of translated text, and when she looked up, there was no hesitation left in her face at all. "Because this page contains a mistranslated clause," she said, "and the person who wrote it was counting on no one in this room being able to read the original." That sentence changed the room more than any raised voice could have. The delegates stopped rustling papers. Edmund's cane settled hard against the carpet and stayed there. Sebastian looked as if he wanted to interrupt, but for once he understood that cutting across her now would only expose how far ahead of him she already was. Dalia slid the annex free from the stack and flattened it with her palm. The page made a dry whisper under her hand. It was only one sheet, tucked between schedules and tariff notes, the kind of thing tired people skim while thinking about lunch or signatures, or how quickly they can get back to the city. That was the danger of it. The trap had been hidden where boredom lives. "The original text," she said, turning first to the silver-haired delegate, "creates a temporary holding mechanism for shipping income while the new routes are tested. Temporary, limited, reviewable." Then she looked at Edmund and translated it for him in plain English. No legal fog, no grand phrasing. "The money stays under the estate's authority, with outside oversight for bookkeeping only." She touched the summary version. "This one says something else." The legal advisor moved closer. He smelled faintly of wet wool and tobacco, and when he leaned over the table, his cuff brushed the paper. "Read it aloud." Dalia did. Slowly. Once in the contract language, once again in English, and then a third time in the delegate's preferred business tongue, so there could be no argument that she was dressing it up. By the second reading, even Sebastian could hear the shift. The summary no longer described a temporary safeguard. It described transfer capacity, cleanly enough for any opportunist with patience and a decent banker to build a shell trust around it later. The woman with the notebook let out a low breath through her nose. "That is no summary error." "No," said Dalia. "It's a door." Edmund's eyes cut toward Sebastian. "How many people saw this before it reached my table?" Sebastian swallowed. "Adrian, the interpreter. My office clerk, perhaps. I assumed—" "Yes," Edmund said, voice rough now. "That seems to be the problem." Beatrice had not moved from her chair, but her hands were clenched in the shawl across her lap. The fire beside her snapped softly, throwing a wash of heat that never seemed to reach her. She looked at Dalia with the stunned concentration of someone who has spent years being spoken around and had suddenly found the one person in the room willing to speak clearly. "If they had signed this today," she asked, "how long before we'd have felt it?" Dalia looked back to the annex, then to the preceding page, then to a note in the margin of the visitor's copy. That was another problem. The margin mark existed on their side, not the Hale's. Someone had already been discussing adjustments without showing the family everything. "Not immediately," she said. "That's why it's dangerous. First, the income stream gets routed through the trust. Then review rights shift. Then, if there's any dispute, delay, or claim of underperformance, the trust can act as if it's protecting the asset while it's actually swallowing it." The room went so still she could hear logs settling in the grate. The silver-haired delegate folded his hands behind his back. "Our consortium did not authorize any covert transfer arrangement. If such language entered the papers, it did not come from us." The legal advisor nodded once. "And if someone on the estate side inserted it, hoping we would overlook it, they badly misjudged today." Sebastian's face flushed dark with anger, but it was no longer aimed at Dalia. It had turned outward now, toward a shape he could not yet fully see. "Get Adrian on the telephone," he said to the steward. "Now!" The steward hurried to the sideboard where the house line sat under a silver lamp. His forgiveness slipped once on the receiver. No one commented. Everyone in that room was fraying. While he tried the number, Dalia kept reading. That was what unnerved them most. She kept moving, scanning line after line, comparing font spacing, dates, notation marks, the faint pressure of pen strokes where someone had once written a note and removed it. It worked. It sorted. It listened. It noticed where one phrase did not sit naturally beside another. She lifted the top sheet from the visitor's bundle. "Who wrote this marginal note?" The notebook woman stepped forward. "I did. Why?" "This phrase here," Dalia pointed. "You questioned a discrepancy in freight liability. You wrote that the summary seemed softer than the base language. You were right to flag it." The woman stared. "You can read my shorthand?" "Enough of it." That earned the first look in the room that held something close to respect without reservation. At the sideboard, the steward turned back, face even paler. "Mr. Cross isn't answering at his office, sir, nor at the club." Sebastian muttered a curse under his breath. "Try his driver," Edmund said. "I already did." "And?" The steward hesitated just long enough for dread to spread before he spoke. "The driver says Mr." Cross dismissed the car this morning and took a hired motor instead. He also asked that 2 dispatch cases be sent ahead to the lower gate. Dahlia's head came up. 2 cases, she said. "Yes." She looked down at the papers again, then at the empty space where the interpreter should have been standing, then at the annex in her hand. Something connected. Not fully, not yet, but enough to chill her. "There should be 3 supporting files for a contract like this," she said quietly. "Tariffs, route certifications, and beneficiary schedules." The legal advisor frowned. "Correct." Dalia counted the stacks on the table. 1, 2. Then she looked at Sebastian. "We're not missing a man," she said. "We're missing a file." The words hit Sebastian harder than the accusation against Adrian had. "A missing file?" he said. "You're guessing." Dalia shook her head once. "No. This annex points to a supporting beneficiary schedule. It's referenced twice by code and once by date. The tariff file is here. The route certifications are here. The schedule that links the trust language to actual family rights is not." She slid the pages toward the legal advisor. "If that schedule is gone, whoever removed it knew this clause could not stand scrutiny with the names attached." The advisor checked the references himself, his dry fingers moving quickly now. A faint flush rose up his neck. "She is correct." Edmund's jaw tightened. "Then we find it." The room broke into motion at last. Chairs scraped. The steward hurried out to summon office staff. Mrs. Fenn set down her untouched tray and moved to Beatrice's side without being asked, one hand resting lightly on the older woman's shoulder. Sebastian stood very still for a moment, then turned to Dalia with a look she had never seen on him before. It was not kindness. He was not transformed. But panic had stripped his arrogance down to something rawer. Dependence. "If there's another copy," he said, "where would it be?"
"In the estate office first, in the dispatch cabinet second. If the interpreter was helping draft the summaries, he may have kept a working copy with notation marks."
Her eyes moved toward the door.
"And if Adrian arranged to send out 2 cases this morning, I want to know who carried them."
Sebastian snapped toward the hallway. "Get Owen from the office." That surprised Dalia. So the clerk had a name after all. Owen arrived within minutes, breathless, ink on 2 fingers, spectacles slipping down his nose. He looked barely old enough to shave properly, and he entered the drawing room with the careful dread of a man who knew one wrong sentence could cost him his place. When he saw Dalia standing at the contract table with the delegates gathered around her, confusion flashed across his face. Then a quick, private spark of relief, as if the strange order of the world had given him permission to speak honestly for once. "Sir?" he said to Sebastian. "Answer exactly," Sebastian told him. "Were there 3 supporting files attached to this contract package?" Owen glanced at the table, recognized the reference codes, and nodded at once. "Yes, sir. 3. Freight tariffs, route certifications, and family beneficiary Schedule B." "Did you see Schedule B this morning?" "I saw it last night." That changed everything again. Dalia stepped closer, focused. "Who handled it after you?" Owen swallowed. "Mr. Cross asked to review the bundle in the West study after dinner. The interpreter joined him there later. I brought tea around 10. The fire was still lit. They had documents spread over the low table and the desk both." Sebastian's head jerked up. Why was I not told they were still working that late? The young clerk blinked, terrified by the force of the question. "You were out with Mr. Cross before supper, sir. I thought you knew." He probably had known, or thought he knew enough. Dalia could see the shame flicker across Sebastian's face before anger covered it again. "What happened after tea?" she asked. Owen looked at her now, and his tone changed. He answered her more steadily than he had answered Sebastian. "I came back near midnight to leave the revised customs estimates. Mr. Cross had gone. The interpreter was alone. He was packing papers into 2 leather cases. One was the brown estate case. The other was his own black one." "The seals?" Dalia asked. That question made Owen pause. His eyes widened slightly. "The brown case had the office seal when I first brought the papers. Later," he licked his lip, remembering. "Later, the wax looked softer, as if it had been warmed and pressed again." The legal advisor gave a grim nod. "Resealed." Dalia's fingers rested on the annex, feeling the grain of the paper. "Did you see the beneficiary schedule after that?" "No. This morning the package on the dispatch table held only 2 supporting files. I assumed one had been moved to the signing folio upstairs." Sebastian swore under his breath. Outside the drawing room, the storm had thinned to a soft hiss against gravel. Somewhere in the house, a door banged, then footsteps pounded past. The delegates had become witnesses. The silver-haired principal stood with his hands behind his back, watching Dalia the way a shipmaster watches the one person on deck who still seems to know where the rocks are. She turned another page, then another, searching for the point where the missing schedule mattered most. And there it was. An internal cross-reference tied to one more clause no one had yet examined carefully. Her pulse kicked once, hard. "This isn't only about Beatrice's protection," she said. Edmund looked up sharply. "What else?" Dalia drew the page free and laid it flat under the lamplight. "If Schedule B was removed, then this clause becomes unreadable in practice. And that means someone could pretend the trust covered only shipping oversight, while attaching family control rights to it later." The legal advisor leaned in. "Can you prove that from what remains?" "Maybe," she said, "if the margin numbering hasn't been altered." Owen spoke up before anyone asked him. "Miss Novak." Every face turned to him. He flinched, then forced himself to continue. There may be something else. When I collected the customs estimates from the West study this morning, I found a torn slip in the grate. Only a corner. I kept it because I thought the code on it looked familiar. He reached into his vest pocket with trembling fingers. And if I'm right, he said, holding out a charred scrap of paper, this piece belonged to Schedule B. Owen held the charred scrap as if it might burn him a second time. Dalia took it carefully by the clean corner, keeping her fingers off the blackened edge. The paper was brittle, warm no longer, but still carrying that stale, sour scent of old ash and scorched glue. One side had burned away into a crescent bite. The other still showed a fragment of typed code, half a line of small print, and the lower stroke of what might have been a handwritten initial in blue pencil. She angled it toward the lamp. The brass shade threw a clean yellow pool across the table, and for a few seconds she said nothing at all. Sebastian could not bear silence anymore. Well? It came from Schedule B, she said. You can tell that from a scrap? Yes. She turned it so the others could see. The coding format matches the annex references on the trust page. Same alignment, same office machine. And this paper stock is lighter than the tariff file, thinner than the root certificates. Whoever tore it out did it in haste. Whoever tried to burn it did not stay long enough to make sure it was gone. The legal advisor leaned in until his spectacles nearly touched the page. What about the blue mark? Dalia narrowed her eyes. Not office ink, pencil, soft lead. She looked at Owen. Who in the study uses blue marking pencil? The young clerk answered too quickly to be inventing. Mr. Cross does. He says ordinary graphite gets lost on cream paper. A small, cold shift moved through the room. Mrs. Fen pressed her lips together. Beatrice's hand tightened on her shawl again. Sebastian looked as though he wanted to deny the relevance of every object Adrian had ever touched, but the facts were piling up too fast now, and all of them were small, ugly, practical things, not grand betrayals. A warmed wax seal, a missing file, a blue pencil. That was how real ruin arrived, in details wealthy people believed were beneath them. Dalia lifted the scrap higher. There's more. She traced the surviving print with the edge of her nail. This line doesn't list a cargo class. It lists a beneficiary category. Edmund straightened despite the strain in his shoulders. Read it. It's incomplete. She drew a breath, listening to her own instinct before speaking again. But enough remains to tell us the missing schedule separated the family into groups. Managing signatories, secured dependents, and contingent beneficiaries. The legal advisor's head came up sharply. If that is true, then the missing schedule did more than name people. It defined who could be squeezed out if control shifted. Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment. The firelight moved across her face, showing the fine lines there, the fatigue, the old sadness of someone who had spent years being treated as a sentimental obligation instead of a legal person. Dalia saw it and felt, under all the tension, a hardening purpose. This was no longer only about proving she spoke 10 languages. This was about making sure one quiet woman was not erased in language nobody expected her to understand. Bring me the ash from the West study grate, Dalia said. Sebastian blinked. What? The ash and the poker, carefully. If one corner survived, others may have. Mrs. Fenn moved before he could argue. Nell, she called toward the hall. A scullery maid appeared almost at once, cheeks pink from running, apron dusted with flour. She could not have been more than 17. She looked from the dignitaries to Dalia and seemed stunned to hear the housemaid giving orders in that room. Then she saw Mrs. Fenn's face and understood this was no game. Take a coal tray and a clean cloth, said the housekeeper. Go to the West study. Bring every bit of paper ash you can find. Don't shake it. Don't spill it. Nell nodded and flew. While they waited, Dalia turned back to Owen. When you saw the two cases, were both equally full? He frowned, thinking. No. The Brown estate case was heavier. I remember because the interpreter lifted it with both hands from the low table. The black case, that one he tucked under his arm. Too small for a full annex bundle, she murmured. Sebastian heard that. Meaning? Meaning the missing schedule may never have left in the case at all. She looked at the torn scrap again. Someone removed at least one page near the fire. If Adrian intended to carry the evidence away, he wouldn't burn part of it in the same room unless he was interrupted or changing plan. The silver-haired delegate gave her a long, measuring look. You think they split the document? One man leaves, one part stays hidden. Yes. Where? She glanced around the drawing room, then toward the corridor, seeing the house not as servants' passages and polished halls, but as a machine for moving paper, gossip, money, and secrets. Rich houses loved cabinets, desks with false bottoms, dispatch boxes, flower presses, locked sideboards no one had opened in years because the key was always somewhere safe. Then her gaze stopped on the steward. Who keeps the outgoing log for the lower gate? She asked. I do, he said. And where is it? In the office downstairs. Bring it. He hurried out. Sebastian looked at her with open frustration now. You think a gate book matters more than finding Adrian? Yes, she said, because men lie. Logs often don't. That silenced him. A minute later, Nell returned, breathless, carrying a black coal tray lined with a folded white kitchen cloth. Gray ash, paper curls, and a few darker lumps lay inside. The smell hit the room first: smoke, old soot, and something chemical from singed ceiling wax. Dalia bent over it, using the poker tip to separate the fragments. Her movements were delicate, patient, exact. Hidden brilliance rarely looked dramatic up close. It looked like this: steady hands doing work other people had dismissed. She teased out one half-burned strip, then another. A name ending in rice, a reference number, a margin slash in blue. And then she found the piece that made her stop. Not because it carried a full name. It didn't. It carried an instruction. Enclose only after signature authority from S.H. Sebastian. Saw the letters at the same instant she did, and the steward, returning with the gate log under his arm, froze in the doorway and said, in a voice gone thin with shock, Sir, there was an unsigned envelope sent to the lower gate under your initials this morning. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Sebastian turned so fast the edge of his coat struck the table. What did you say? The steward clutched the gate ledger tighter against his ribs, as if he wished he had never opened it. An envelope, sir, entered in the lower gate book just after 8. No destination written, only private dispatch. The initials beside it are yours. They are not mine, Sebastian snapped. Dalia did not look at him. Show us. The steward crossed the room and laid the ledger beside the contracts. The leather cover was cracked at the corners, the pages rough with years of dust and thumbprints. Dalia bent over it. The ink lines were neat, the columns ruled by hand, the entries short and practical. Milk deliveries, feed sacks, orchard receipts, then the morning line in question. Private dispatch, lower gate. One sealed envelope, authorized S.H. She touched the initials lightly. These were copied by the gate porter, not signed by Sebastian directly. Sebastian seized on that at once. There, anyone could have written them. Yes, Dalia said, but not anyone would know they'd pass without question. That stung because it was true. The entire house ran on assumptions. A good suit, a confident voice, the right initials, and doors opened. Edmund leaned forward, face drawn tight with fatigue and anger. Who was on lower gate duty? Pritchard, sir, said the steward. He's been there 12 years. Bring him. A footman was sent at once. While they waited, Dalia read the line above and the line below. One orchard manifest had left at 7:40. A crate of machine parts had come in at 8:15. The dispatch sat between them, neat and unremarkable, exactly where a dishonest man would hide it. Her eyes moved to the time mark again. 8 o'clock, she murmured. Before the delegation arrived. before the missing interpreter disappeared from his room. The silver-haired delegate nodded grimly. So one piece left by gate while another vanished inside the house. And someone expected the rest of us to spend the day blaming confusion, said the notebook woman. Mrs. Fenn, still beside Beatrice, gave a low sound of disgust. Confusion is a rich man's favorite hiding place. No one contradicted her. When Pritchard was finally brought in, he looked as if he had been pulled away from hammering something in the rain. His boots were damp, his cap still in his hands, his broad red fingers stained with grease. He stopped dead when he saw the whole room assembled around a contract table, and Dalia at the center of it. His eyes flicked to Sebastian, then to Edmund. "Sir?" Edmund spoke first. "You logged a private dispatch under my son's initials this morning. Tell the truth and tell it cleanly." Pritchard swallowed. "Aye, sir. A sealed envelope, handed over by Mr. Cross's man." "Mr. Cross has a man?" Sebastian asked, stunned. "A temporary driver, sir, not the regular one. Said he was in a hurry." Dalia looked up sharply. "Describe the envelope." "Cream stock, long, red wax, though the seal looked smudged, like it had been pressed twice. I asked whether it should go through the house post, but the fellow said Mr. Hale had authorized gate dispatch to avoid delay." "Which Mr. Hale?" she asked. Pritchard blinked. "He said the young master." Sebastian took a step forward. "And you believed him?" The porter's face reddened. "Begging pardon, sir, but Mr. Cross had come and gone under your orders for months. He used your study, he carried your papers, he spoke like a man expected." Again, that same small, brutal truth. The house had helped deceive itself. Dalia turned another page in the ledger. "Did anyone else pass through around that time?" Pritchard frowned and scratched his jaw. "The interpreter, maybe 10 minutes later. Walking, not driving, black case under his arm, seemed flustered. Asked whether the east path was quicker to the village road." Sebastian stared. "You saw him leave and didn't report it?" "He said the meeting time had changed, sir. Claimed he'd been sent for a revision copy." The legal advisor let out a bitter breath. They split their exits. Dalia's mind clicked through the sequence. One envelope out the lower gate. One man out on foot. One heavier case packed in the west study. One half-burned schedule left behind. It was no longer a blur of suspicion. It was logistics. And logistics always told the truth if you lined up the movements carefully enough. She turned to Pritchard again. "This driver, which way did he go after the dispatch?" "North Road first, ma'am. Then I lost sight of him by the U-bend." "And the interpreter?" "Village Road." Two routes, two hands carrying two parts of the same trick. The steward cleared his throat, still shaken. If the envelope held the missing beneficiary page and the interpreter carried the working copies, then Adrian may have planned to reunite them elsewhere. Dalia nodded slowly. Or pass one piece onward while keeping the other as leverage. Sebastian stared at the ledger as if it were accusing him personally. In a way, it was. His carelessness had given Adrian the exact cover he needed. Dalia could feel the weight of the room shifting again. The delegates were no longer merely impressed by 10 languages. They were beginning to trust her reasoning more than the family's authority, and that was dangerous for Sebastian in a way mockery had never been. Then Beatrice spoke, very softly. "If that schedule left the estate," she said, "does that mean my name is already in someone else's hands?" Dalia looked at her, and for the first time all morning, she did not answer at once. Because there was one more possibility. The charred scrap, the missing file, the envelope, the split routes, and the line on the burned page about signature authority from S.H. Someone had expected a signature still to happen. She turned back to the annex and ran her finger beneath the trust clause, then to a small notation mark in the margin of the visitor's copy that she had not fully considered before. A tiny symbol, harmless-looking, easy to dismiss, except it matched the shorthand on the burned fragment. Her pulse jumped. "No," she said quietly. "If I'm right, they didn't need Beatrice's name outside the house yet. Edmund's voice went low. Why not? Dalia lifted the page and looked directly at him. Because the final version was meant to be completed here, after you signed. That landed with a heavier force than any accusations so far, because it meant the theft was unfinished. Sebastian's face drained. You're saying they planned to alter the final papers after my father put his name on them? Dalia kept her gaze on the annex. I'm saying this mark wasn't for decoration. She touched the tiny symbol in the margin. It corresponds to the burned instruction and to a blank cross-reference here. This page was designed to receive information later. Names, authority status, perhaps signature placement. If Edmund had signed while relying on the summary, the final beneficiary schedule could have been attached afterward and made to look consistent with the signed authority. The legal advisor from the delegation nodded slowly, and that slow nod was worse than outrage. It was professional recognition. A staged completion, he said. Crude in spirit, clever in mechanics. Edmund let out a long breath through his nose. Meaning they needed my signature first, the missing schedule second, and enough confusion around translation to hide the join. Exactly, said Dalia. Beatrice looked from Edmund to Sebastian and then to the page in Dalia's hand. Her voice was fragile, but it did not shake. So if she had not spoken, if she had simply remained what we all assumed she was. No one answered that. No one could. The silver-haired delegate moved to the far end of the table and rested both hands on the polished wood. For the record, our consortium will not proceed one line further until we know whether this manipulation came from inside the Hale estate or from the vanished interpreter acting with outside help. Sebastian flinched. Reputation. Trust. The thing rich men spent years wearing like armor. Dalia saw it strike him, but she had no space left in herself to pity him yet. She turned instead to the practical question. If the final version was meant to be completed here, then there must be a place in this house where the missing schedule could be inserted quickly before dispatch. Somewhere private, close to the signing room, easy for Adrian to reach. The West Study, Sebastian said at once. Dalia shook her head. Too obvious now. Too far once guests arrived. They would need a place between the office flow and the family rooms, somewhere papers move without being noticed. Mrs. Fenn answered from beside the fire. The morning room cabinet. Every head turned toward her. She lifted her chin, unbothered by the attention. Your mother kept account books there for years, Mr. Hale. After she passed, the room became a dumping place for floral invoices, guest menus, church notices, all the paper nobody values enough to destroy. Mr. Cross has been using it recently when he takes calls. I've seen him shut the door with folders under his arm. Sebastian stared. Why was I not told? Mrs. Finn's eyes were flint. Because you never ask what happens in rooms you call unimportant. That shut him up. Dalia felt the room pivot again, with the plain momentum of truth. Overlooked people were now supplying the map. The clerk, the porter, the scullery maid, the housekeeper. One by one, the house itself was testifying against the arrogance that ran it. Edmund tightened his hand on the cane. Search the morning room. Sebastian moved instantly this time, but Dalia stopped him with one sentence. Don't go alone. He looked at her, insult rising by instinct. You think I can't open a cabinet? I think if Adrian prepared this carefully, he prepared for discovery too. If you find something, you need witnesses. The legal advisor gave a curt nod. Agreed. So they went together, Sebastian, Dalia, the steward, Owen with his ink-stained fingers, the legal advisor, and one of the delegates as neutral observer. The corridor outside the drawing room felt colder than before. Their steps moved over runner carpets and polished boards, past portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow them, past a side table where lilies had begun to turn sweet and heavy in the vase. Somewhere downstairs, servants whispered and then fell silent as the group passed. The morning room sat on the south side of the estate, smaller than the library, brighter in summer,
used now mostly for ignored correspondence and awkward tea visits. When Mrs. Fenn opened the door, stale paper and furniture polish met them first. Sunlight pushed weakly through thin cloud, laying pale bars across an oval table cluttered with old almanacs, cracked invitation boxes, and a brass letter scale. Against the wall stood a painted cabinet with pigeonholes above and 2 locked drawers below. Sebastian crossed to it immediately. Key? Mrs. Fenn already had one. Of course she did.
The housekeeper held the keys to forgotten kingdoms. The top compartments yielded nothing but household clutter. Ribbons, old place cards, seed catalogs, unused stationery stamped with the Hale crest. The first lower drawer contained account scraps and menu lists. The second stuck halfway, then jerked open with a dusty groan. Inside lay 3 things: a blue marking pencil, a folded sheet of cream paper sealed but not addressed, and a small leather notebook Dalia had never seen before. No one spoke for a moment. Sebastian reached for the sealed paper, but Dalia caught the movement. "Wait!" The legal advisor stepped beside her. "She's right. We open this in order." Dalia pointed first to the pencil. "That confirms nothing by itself." Then to the notebook. "That matters more." Owen swallowed. "It's not a state issue. Our office books are green." The leather was black, soft at the corners from use, with a faint smell of tobacco and damp wool. Dalia lifted it carefully and opened to the first written page. Not neat paragraphs, columns, abbreviations, root marks, fee splits, dates, names reduced to initials. Her pulse quickened at once. "This isn't household business," she said. Sebastian leaned in despite himself. "What is it?" Dalia scanned another page, then another. One note referenced trust timing. Another listed dispatch stages. A third tied B schedule to post-signature insertion. The handwriting changed midway through the book, one hand sharp and slanted, another heavier, more impatient. She went still, because near the back, written beside a date from 2 weeks earlier, was a line that did not mention Beatrice, or shipping, or tariffs. It mentioned Edmund Hale's failing strength and a plan to press signing before the sister is consulted. And tucked into the back flap of the notebook was a pressed calling card with one name embossed in black: Adrian Cross. But beneath it, half hidden under the card, was something far worse. A note in Sebastian's own hand. No one in the morning room breathed for a second after Dalia saw Sebastian's handwriting. The note was small, folded once, and flattened from having been tucked behind the calling card for some time. The paper was finer than the office stock, faintly scented with cigar smoke and cedar from whatever pocketbook it had lived in before being hidden in the cabinet. Sebastian reached for it on instinct, but the legal advisor's hand came down between them. "No," he said. "It gets read where it lies." Dalia opened the fold carefully. She knew Sebastian's hand now, at least enough to recognize the hard slant of it, the impatient downward strokes, the way he crossed a T too far to the right. Men who write like that usually believe speed can replace thought. The note was brief enough to do damage. A. Use my authority if father stalls again. Keep B off principal schedule until review. Will regularize after signing. S.H. The room went hollow. Sebastian stared at the paper as if it had risen from the dead to betray him. "That is not what it sounds like." Edmund's voice came from behind them, low and hoarse. He had made his way to the doorway despite everyone trying to spare him the walk. Beatrice was with him now, one hand gripping the frame, Mrs. Fenn at her shoulder. "Then tell me," he said, "what exactly it sounds like." Sebastian's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. The old ease was gone from him. So was the polished cruelty from the library. What stood there now was a man caught between shame and self-preservation, trying to speak past both. "Adrian told me we needed a temporary structure," he said. "A cleaner chain of signatory control. He said Aunt Beatrice's position was secure regardless, but that older beneficiary language confused outside partners and slowed negotiations. He said if we delayed over family categories, the commanders might walk. Beatrice did not flinch. That somehow made it worse. So you agreed to remove me from the principal schedule? Temporarily, Sebastian said, and even he seemed to hear how thin that sounded. Dalia looked back down at the note. You wrote, "Use my authority." That means Adrian had permission to act in your name before the final review. I gave him room to prepare drafts, Sebastian shot back. I did not give him permission to steal the estate. No, said Dalia quietly. You gave him something more useful. Credibility. That struck cleanly, and he had no answer. The legal advisor extended his hand. The sealed envelope. Mrs. Fenn passed it to Dalia. The wax had already been disturbed once, then pressed back into shape. Another reseal. Another small, grubby certainty. She slipped a letter knife under the edge and opened it without tearing the paper. Inside was a folded packet tied with narrow red ribbon. One sheet, then another, then a cover page, Schedule B. The missing file was here. Owen made a sound under his breath, half relief, half dread. Sebastian took one involuntary step closer. Edmund stayed where he was, but the hand on his cane tightened until the knuckles whitened. Dalia laid the pages on the small oval table beneath the window. Rainlight and lamplight mixed over the paper, pale and unforgiving. She skimmed the headings first, then the category columns, then the beneficiary names. Her pulse steadied instead of racing. This was the part of her that had been built long before Hale Estate, long before polished rooms and imported glass. The part forged in cramped places where one wrong reading could cost somebody rent, medicine, work, or safe passage. When she read now, she did not drift. She locked in. The first line named Edmund. The second named Sebastian as active managing signatory under transitional authority. Then came the protected dependents. Beatrice's name was there, but moved. Not secured, contingent. The change was marked in blue pencil. There, Dalia said, pointing to the category shift. That is where the mistranslated clause does its real work. In the trust page, the summary narrows protection. In this schedule, that narrowing gets weaponized. The silver-haired delegate, who had followed them from the drawing room, swore softly in his own language. The notebook woman read over Dalia's shoulder and shook her head once. This was built backward, she said. They drafted the beneficiary damage first, then adjusted the language around it. Yes, said Dalia. That's why the summaries feel smooth. They were written to lead people toward this result. Sebastian dragged a hand over his face. I never saw this version. No, Dalia said, because if you had, you might have noticed what it would make you. He looked at her sharply. What? She traced the next paragraph. Smaller print, denser wording. Easy to skip if your mind had already caught on the family names and moved on. But she had spent the morning proving what people like Sebastian never imagined, that 10 languages were only part of her gift. She could also hear danger in administrative phrasing. This schedule gives you temporary control, she said. Only temporary. Edmund frowned. Then who takes it after? The legal advisor bent lower. Read that line. Dalia did. In the event of incapacity, dispute, or commercial non-performance by the active managing signatory, interim authority shall pass to the designated external trustee named under Annexed Instrument C. A silence heavier than the others settled over the room. Owen whispered, There's an Instrument C? There is now, Dalia said. She checked the packet again. No Annex C inside, just the reference, another missing piece, another door prepared in advance. The silver-haired delegate's expression had gone hard as iron. Can you identify the trustee from anything here? Dalia looked at the bottom of the page. There in the lower right corner, beside the filing notation and draft sequence marks, was a tiny embossed stamp almost hidden under the fold crease. Not a full name, just 3 letters in a commercial crest. A-C-H. Sebastian saw it when she did, and from somewhere back in the corridor, a servant's voice rang out, breathless with alarm.
Mr.
Cross is here, and he says he's ready to sign. The message from the corridor struck the room like a thrown knife. Sebastian moved first, half in anger, half in disbelief. Here? The footman at the door looked rattled enough to drop the tray he still carried. In the front hall, sir. He says there's been a misunderstanding and that the visitors shouldn't be kept waiting any longer. Of course he did. Men like Adrian never arrived looking hunted. They arrived with their collars straight, their gloves clean, and a ready explanation already polished. Dalia felt something settle inside her then, something colder than fear. He had come back because he believed he still controlled the pace of the day. He thought the house was still his stage. Edmund's voice cut through the tension. Bring him to the drawing room, not here. The legal advisor agreed at once. Yes, all principals present. No private conversation. Mrs. Fenn stepped aside so Edmund and Beatrice could turn back toward the corridor. Owen gathered the schedule pages with trembling care, while Dalia took the black notebook, the note in Sebastian's hand, and the sealed packet. She carried them flat against her palm, feeling the weight of paper that smelled faintly of dust, wax, and old tobacco. Strange how the fate of a family could sit so lightly in the hand. As they walked back through the corridor, Sebastian fell in beside her. He spoke low so only she could hear. I was a fool, he said. It was the first honest sentence she had ever heard from him. She did not soften. Yes. He took that without protest. His face was pale now, but not with the same anger as before. Something harsher had entered him. The realization that arrogance had made him useful to a man far cleverer than he was. Dalia kept walking. By the time they re-entered the drawing room, the atmosphere had changed again. The delegates were no longer restless guests trapped in a delayed meeting. They had become witnesses to an exposure. The contract pages still lay open on the long table. The coffee had gone cold. Rainwater shone in a silver bead on the windowsill where someone had left the latch loose. Aunt Beatrice resumed her chair by the fire, but now she sat upright, as if the truth had given even her frail body something new to brace against. Then Adrian Cross came in. He did not rush. He wore a charcoal coat, still damp at the shoulders, gloves in one hand, hat in the other, and he carried that smooth look of composed inconvenience men put on when they expect to control a room with manners. He paused just inside the threshold, taking in the delegates, Edmund, Sebastian, and finally Dalia standing at the table with the papers in front of her. A flicker crossed his face. Tiny, fast, but it was there. My apologies, he said. There was a delay with revised customs handling at the village office. I understand we're all eager to proceed. No one invited him farther in. Edmund spoke first. You may set the performance aside. Where is the missing beneficiary schedule? Adrian blinked once, then gave the faintest puzzled smile. I'm sorry? Dalia laid the schedule packet on the table where everyone could see it. We found it. That smile did not vanish. It only shifted shape. Then I'm glad the confusion has been cleared. Has it? Asked the silver-haired delegate. Adrian spread his hands. In any complex transaction, drafts circulate. Pages move. People panic. I assume some overexcited conclusions have been reached. Dalia opened the notebook and turned it toward him. Do you call this a draft tool too? He looked at it. This time the flicker was stronger. Still, he recovered quickly. A working ledger. Notes, nothing more. The legal advisor stepped closer. Notes including post-signature insertion of a beneficiary schedule? Adrian's gaze cut to Sebastian in a flash so quick most people in the room might have missed it. Dalia did not. That glance carried calculation. What does he know? What will he deny? Can I still use him? Sebastian saw it too. His jaw clenched. Don't.
Don't what?
Adrian asked mildly. Don't look at me as if this still belongs to both of us. There it was. Not confession exactly, but fracture. The first clean break between them. Adrian drew a slow breath and shifted strategies. Very well. Let's speak plainly. Sebastian wanted the estate modernized. He wanted faster authority, fewer family obstacles, a structure that reassured outside partners. I advised on options. If a line was too aggressive in one draft, that hardly makes it criminal. Beatrice's voice came from the fire, thin but sharp as cut glass. You remove me from protection. Adrian turned to her with an expression so smooth it was almost insulting. Miss Hale, no one intended personal harm. No? Dalia said. She slid the note in Sebastian's hand out from the black card and placed it beside the schedule. Then what did you intend with this? For the first time, Adrian did not answer immediately. Sebastian shut his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them, the shame in him had become something more useful. Anger directed at the right person. I wrote that, he said before Adrian could twist it. But I wrote it believing Beatrice's position would remain intact. He told me keep B off principal schedule meant clearing clutter from the signing layout. He said we'd regularize the filing after the deal. Dalia did not rescue him from his own stupidity. She didn't need to. The room could see it well enough. Adrian gave a soft, disbelieving laugh. And now we're meant to treat the testimony of a housemaid as superior to documented business process? That was the old weapon, brought back out because he had little else left. Rank contempt. The hope that if he named her station aloud, the room would remember the shape of the ladder and climb back onto it. But the room did not move with him. The silver-haired delegate looked at Dalia, not Adrian. The legal advisor looked at the mistranslated clause, not at her apron. Edmund's eyes stayed fixed on the man who had walked into his house carrying fraud like a briefcase. Even Sebastian did not come to Adrian's aid. Adrian saw that too. So he shifted again, faster now. Fine, let's say there was a drafting issue. Then the practical question is simple. Do we correct it and sign, or do we destroy the estate over a procedural mess? Dalia answered before anyone else could. We can't correct what you still haven't produced. He smiled thinly. Produced what? She turned to the schedule again and tapped the lower reference where the external trustee was named under annexed instrument C. The last piece, she said, the one you thought was still hidden. And for the first time since he walked in, Adrian Cross lost the room behind his eyes. That flicker in Adrian's face lasted less than a second, but by then Dalia had learned how much damage could hide inside half a breath. He recovered fast. Men like him always did. His shoulders stayed loose, his mouth settled into that patient smile he used when he wanted everyone else to feel emotional and unreasonable. There is no hidden instrument, he said. You're building a melodrama out of draft notation. Dalia did not argue with his tone. She went back to the paper. The room watched her in silence as she turned the schedule toward the light from the windows. Rain had thinned outside, and the gray noon glow showed things lamplight softened. Fibers in the paper, pressure marks in the margin. A faint rectangular shadow near the lower fold where another sheet had once rested on top of it long enough to leave a memory behind. She lowered her head slightly, and a smell rose from the documents. Dust, sealing wax, cold fireplace ash, the faint bitterness of blue pencil shavings. This was where she was strongest. In noise, she listened. In chaos, she separated the strands. Then explain this, she said. She placed the page flat and pointed to the bottom edge where the filing marks sat. Instrument C is referenced as annexed under the same draft family as Schedule B, but the spacing is wrong. It was inserted after the line was typed. This mark here, she tapped a tiny, uneven gap before the final code. It means the typist came back to add it later. The legal advisor leaned so close his sleeve brushed hers. Yes, he said quietly. She's right. Adrian shrugged. A clerical amendment,
No, Dalia said. A late attachment point. Sebastian stood near the mantel now, one hand braced against it, as if he needed the carved wood to hold him upright. He looked sick, ashamed. The difference mattered. Every word Dalia uncovered was peeling away another layer of the life he had built on being the smartest man in the room. It turned out he had not even been the smartest man in his own study. Edmund's voice came rough from the wing chair where Mrs. Fenn had finally forced him to sit. "If there is another paper, where is it?" That question pulled everyone forward again. Dalia closed the black notebook and reopened it near the back, where Adrian's sharper notes gave way to heavier writing. 2 hands, 2 rhythms. One planned, one approved. She ran her finger down the columns until she found the same code family as Schedule B, then a smaller note in slanted shorthand. She read it once in silence, then again more slowly. "Ready on hall side," she said. Adrian's expression tightened. "That proves nothing." She ignored him and kept reading. "Attach after EH executes. If interruption, hold C apart and rejoin via case file." The silver-haired delegate let out a soft curse. Sebastian stared. "Case file? Which case?" Owen answered before anyone else could. "The heavier brown one." Dalia nodded. "Yes, the estate case. The one the interpreter packed with both hands." Adrian tried to cut in. "You are trusting fragments and half-burned scraps over actual business procedure." At that, Beatrice lifted her head. Her face was pale, but her voice had sharpened into something almost elegant. "No, Mr. Cross. We are trusting the first person in this house who has read what is actually in front of us." The words settled over the room like judgment. There it was. Vindication before the household, though not in any way Dalia had imagined when Sebastian laughed in the library. She did not glow under it. She only felt the urgency pressing harder. If Adrian had hidden Instrument C separately, then the document might still be on the estate grounds, or with the interpreter, or waiting in some dispatch packet no one had yet found. And if the interpreter had panicked, he might try to sell that paper to whichever side offered him the safest landing. The legal advisor straightened. "We need to know exactly what Instrument C does." Adrian spread his hands again. "You keep saying need as if this fantasy file has magical powers." Dalia looked up at him at last. "It doesn't need magic. The schedule already shows what it was built to do. Temporary control passes from Sebastian to an external trustee if there's incapacity, dispute, or underperformance. Instrument C would identify that trustee and spell out powers in detail." She paused, letting the implications breathe. "In plain words, it would tell us who was meant to take the estate once the trap was sprung." Edmund shut his eyes briefly. Mrs. Fenn's keys rattled softly at her waist as she shifted beside him. Even that tiny sound seemed loud. The silver-haired delegate asked the next question in his own language, clipped and direct. Dalia answered him fluently without looking away from Adrian. Then she translated back for the room. "He wants to know whether this trustee was meant to be a bank, a holding company, or a private person." Adrian laughed once, softly. "And can the maid answer that too?" Dalia turned the notebook another quarter inch. "Yes." Because there, half buried beneath freight shorthand and payment timings, was a line she had almost missed. A reference to ACH, beside a note reading, "Personal authority preferred over institutional oversight." That meant no distant company and no neutral office. It meant a living hand, a named person, someone who could sign, stall, liquidate, redirect. She looked at the embossed initials on the schedule, then at Adrian's calling card, then at Sebastian's note. A man. "Instrument C names an individual trustee," she said. Sebastian pushed away from the mantel. "You?" Adrian smiled, and it was almost a sneer now. "You still have no paper with my name on it." "No," Dalia said, "but I have something else." She lifted the calling card from the table and turned it over. Blank on the front except his name. Ordinary, respectable. But on the back, pressed so lightly most people would never have noticed,
was a pencil transfer from another document that had once rested on top of it. Just a few mirrored letters, faint, broken. She angled it to the window, narrowed her eyes, and read the impression. Appointed interim trustee, Adrian. Her voice stopped there, not from doubt, but because at that exact moment the butler burst through the doorway, breathing hard, with mud on the hem of his coat. "They found the interpreter's case," he said. "It was thrown into the old pump house, and there's a locked compartment inside." The butler's words broke the standoff in two. Adrian turned toward the door too quickly. It was only a glance, but Dalia caught it. There was no surprise in it, no confusion. He knew about the case, which meant whatever panic the missing interpreter had felt, Adrian had already calculated around it. "Bring it here," Edmund said. "No," Dalia answered at once. Every face shifted to her. She kept her voice steady. "If the compartment is forced in the wrong way, anything inside could be damaged. Or removed before witnesses agree on what was found." She looked at the silver-haired delegate and the legal advisor. "We open it in front of everyone, here, on the contract table." The delegate gave one sharp nod. Agreed. Adrian smiled again, though the corners were tighter now. "You're handing a servant remarkable authority for an afternoon." Edmund did not even look at him. "She has earned more authority in 1 hour than you have in 6 months. That landed hard. Even Sebastian looked away for a moment. The butler hurried off, and the room seemed to contract around the waiting. Rain ticked at the windows. The fire hissed softly behind Beatrice's chair. Owen stood with both hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Mrs. Fenn moved to the drinks sideboard to clear space, as if preparing the room for surgery instead of tea. Adrian tried another angle. "Since we are all so determined to make theater of this, perhaps we should at least remember that a locked compartment proves nothing. The interpreter may have kept private notes, duplicate invoices, even travel papers." Dalia turned the calling card over once more in her hand, then set it beside the schedule. "Maybe. And maybe he kept the one paper you thought would never be read by anyone in this house." His eyes flicked to hers, sharp and cold now. "You think reading 10 languages makes you understand business?" "No," she said. "Listening does." That shut him up for the moment. Sebastian had been silent longer than anyone expected of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, scraped raw by everything that had happened since the library. "If Instrument C names you, say it now." Adrian looked almost bored. "You're in no position to demand anything from me." "I brought you in," Sebastian said. "I signed your access notes. I let you sit in my father's study. If you used me, say it to my face." "Used you?" Adrian gave a soft laugh. "Sebastian, you begged to be treated like a man already in command. All I did was speak to the part of you that couldn't bear waiting." There it was, cruelty. Enough to show the shape of it. Sebastian's face hardened. The shame was still there, but now anger had found its proper address. Before anyone could press further, footsteps sounded in the corridor, fast, heavy, more than one set. Then the butler returned with 2 footmen, carrying the case between them on a folded blanket. Mud streaked the leather. One corner was soaked dark from the pump house floor. The brass lock plate was scratched, and the handle hung at a tired angle as if it had been yanked too hard in haste. The smell hit first. Damp leather, stagnant water, oil, and the cold mineral scent of the old pump house stones. They laid it on the center table. "It was hidden behind the broken cistern," the butler said, breathing hard. "Thomas found it when he went to check the yard drains. The outer latch was unfastened, but this inner panel would not open." Dalia stepped closer. The case had 2 ordinary catches, and inside, a fitted divider lined in dark felt. One panel sat a fraction higher than the others. Not enough for most people to notice, enough for someone like her to pause. She touched the felt edge, then the brass pin near the corner. "Not a key lock," she murmured. "A spring release." The legal advisor moved beside her. "Can you open it?" "Maybe." Adrian folded his arms. If you break it and find nothing, I assume we can all go back to reality. She ignored him again. Dalia bent closer. The felt smelled faintly of tobacco and wet dust. Her fingertips traced the divider seam. The spring had to be triggered by pressure, but not from the front. From the side, perhaps. No, too obvious. She checked the brass corners, then the handle brackets, then the lining under the document straps. And then she saw it. A tiny indentation beside the left retaining rivet, nearly invisible unless the light struck it at a slant. She pressed once. Nothing. Pressed again while lifting the divider edge with her nail. A soft click answered her. No one in the room moved. She slid the hidden panel up. Inside was a narrow compartment wrapped in oilcloth. One long envelope, one folded paper tied with gray string, and beneath them, a small pocket notebook no larger than a hand. Sebastian exhaled sharply. The silver-haired delegate said, "Do not touch anything else until it is identified." Dalia lifted the oilcloth bundle first and laid it on the table. Water had not reached the inner layer. Good. Someone had packed it for protection. The gray string around the folded paper was tied in a clerk's knot, quick and utilitarian. The small notebook was cheaper than Adrian's leather one, with warped cardboard covers and ink marks along the edge. The interpreters, perhaps. Private working notes, panic notes, insurance notes. Which first? Asked the legal advisor. Dalia looked at the three items and felt the order matter. The long envelope, she said. If that's instrument C, everything else changes shape. Adrian said nothing now. That was more telling than any denial. She slid a finger under the flap. The gum had not been sealed all the way. Whoever packed it expected it to be reopened quickly. Inside was a single legal sheet, heavier than the others, with formal margins and witness lines at the bottom. Dalia unfolded it. She read the title once, then again. And when she looked up, even Sebastian seemed afraid of what her face was telling him. "It isn't only a trustee appointment," she said. Edmund's grip tightened on the cane. "What is it?" Dalia lowered her eyes back to the page, and the words felt colder now than the rain on the windows. "It's a conditional transfer instrument," she said. "And if I'm reading this correctly, it was written to take effect the moment your name hit the signing line." The sentence seemed to pull all warmth out of the drawing room. Edmund did not speak at once. Neither did Sebastian. Even Adrian, who had been wriggling through every accusation with a polished answer, went still in a different way now. A man can bluff around suspicions. He cannot bluff comfortably around a document someone else is already reading correctly. Dalia lowered the sheet just enough to look at the legal advisor. "You need the exact wording." "Yes," he said. "Read it as written. No summaries." So she did. Her voice was calm, but the language on the page was vicious in the way clean legal writing can be vicious. The document described a conditional transfer of interim control over shipping income, route authority, and associated estate obligations. On its face, it looked like an emergency protection measure, something to preserve stability if Edmund became unable to manage the signing process or if Sebastian's authority was challenged. But buried in the middle was the real trick. The trigger was not actual incapacity. It was certified uncertainty. And certified uncertainty could be manufactured by dispute, delay, or competing beneficiary claims, the very chaos their other papers had been designed to create. She translated the central passage once in plain English for Edmund and Beatrice. Then she repeated it for the delegates in their own language, and the legal advisor asked her to go back over 2 phrases, line by line. She did, without rushing. "When the old man signs," Adrian said sharply, "the root deal becomes active. That's all this is trying to protect." "No," Dalia said, keeping her eyes on the page. "It activates before the root deal is finalized. It activates on execution of principal consent under disputed beneficiary status." The silver-haired delegate gave a grim nod. That means the family signature itself would be enough if the dispute had already been seated. And it had, said Dalia. She touched the schedule. By moving Beatrice's status. By narrowing protection through the mistranslated clause. By preparing the trust language to absorb the dispute. Beatrice's hand closed around the arm of her chair. So my name was not an inconvenience to be fixed later. It was the mechanism. Dalia looked at her gently. Yes. Adrian laughed once, too suddenly. That's melodrama again. A provisional instrument in a multi-party estate negotiation is normal. The legal advisor turned on him with real contempt now. Not when it appoints a private trustee tied to undeclared control rights. Sebastian had stopped trying to defend himself. He stood slightly apart from the others, face colorless, staring at the conditional transfer page as if it were showing him his own stupidity in black ink. At last, he asked the one question only he could ask. Would it have made me look like I agreed to all of it? Dalia read one more paragraph before answering. Yes. He flinched as though slapped. Because there it was. Adrian had not only planned to corner Edmund and displace Beatrice, he had also built the trap so that if it ever exploded later, Sebastian would stand in the middle of the wreckage looking complicit, greedy, and ready to betray his own family. A useful heir until the door closed, disposable after. Edmund finally found his voice. It was quiet, which made it more dangerous. Read the trustee line. Dalia moved to the lower section. There was a blank on the visible text where the individual trustee's name should have been inserted from a corresponding schedule or appended authority note. But the surrounding language told enough. Male pronoun, single designated trustee, authority to act without household consultation in urgent commercial stabilization. Sebastian stared at Adrian. You. Adrian spread his hands again, but the charm had cracked. You have no completed name on that page. No completed name, Dalia agreed. But you left traces everywhere else. She placed the calling card beside the document, then the hidden schedule, then the black notebook. She pointed out the embossed mark ACH, the mirrored pencil transfer from the card back, the notebook line about personal authority preferred over institutional oversight, the post-signature insertion note, the gate dispatch, the missing schedule, the burnt fragment, the smudged reseals. One by one, the scattered pieces stopped looking like noise and became design. This was the part nobody in the house had expected from the maid they mocked. Structure, pattern. The ability to hear fraud in one room, see it in another, and fit it together faster than the men who thought documents belonged to them by birthright. The legal advisor asked for the folded paper tied with gray string next. Dalia set the transfer instrument aside and untied it carefully. Inside were 2 short witness forms, unsigned, and a page of typed directions for handling corrected annexes after execution. The paper smelled faintly of machine oil from the damp case. One line instructed the interpreter to retain language objections until principal signature secured. Another directed that any challenge from the sister be treated as emotional interference rather than legal standing. Beatrice made a small sound at that. Mrs. Fenn put a hand over hers. The silver-haired delegate's mouth hardened. This is not a drafting dispute. This is a scheme. Yes, said Edmund. Adrian's control finally slipped. You're all pretending this estate wasn't desperate for restructuring. It was sinking. I offered a path. A path to what? Sebastian said. To saving us or to owning us? Adrian looked at him with open contempt now. To rescuing value from a family too sentimental to manage it. That was the first near confession he had given. Dalia could feel the room tightening around him, but there was still one piece left unopened from the hidden compartment. The small, warped notebook, cheaper than the black ledger. Likely the interpreter's, yes, the man who had run, the man who had packed the case and hidden it in the pump house. If he had left behind private notes in his own hand, they might answer the one question still hovering over everything. Was Adrian improvising this alone now that the plan was collapsing? Or had he already lined up the final step with someone else waiting off the estate? She opened the little notebook. The first pages were numbers, travel times, toll charges, 3 lodging addresses, then shorthand phrases in 2 languages. Then, near the middle, 1 page written in a hurried hand so jagged it almost cut the paper. If Cross fails to get signature today, use reserve courier. If Maid speaks, abort hall version. Meet at North Bridge before dusk with... Dalia stopped. Sebastian heard the break in her voice and stepped closer. With who? She lifted her eyes from the page, and for the first time that afternoon, even she looked shaken. Someone from inside the delegation, she said. The words seemed to strike the delegates harder than anything Adrian had said all afternoon. Until that moment, the threat had lived neatly on the Hale side of the table. Adrian, the vanished interpreter, the doctored summaries, Sebastian's stupidity, the family's blind spots. Ugly, yes, but containable. Now the room had to face a worse possibility, that someone had come into the estate under the banner of negotiation while carrying a second loyalty in their pocket. The silver-haired principal straightened so abruptly his chair scraped across the floorboards. The notebook woman's face lost its color. Even the legal advisor, who had kept his reactions disciplined, looked as if a sour taste had reached the back of his throat. That is a serious claim, he said. Dalia kept the small, warped notebook open in both hands. It's not a claim. It's a line in the interpreter's own notes. She drew a breath and read it again, slower. If Cross fails to get signature today, use reserve courier. If Maid speaks, abort hall version. Meet at Northbridge before dusk with... She lifted her eyes. The final name is torn or smeared, but the next line is legible. She turned the page slightly so the legal advisor could see. Bring consortium seal copy. A silence followed that was somehow even colder than the others. Only someone tied to the visiting party could provide a seal copy. Not the family, not the clerk, not Adrian on his own. Someone with access to the delegation's document controls, impression marks, or travel certifying papers. Adrian seized on the pause. Convenient, he said. A missing name and a dramatic interpretation from a maid who has decided she's chief investigator. Sebastian rounded on him. Shut up! That came out with such force that even Adrian blinked. Dalia went on as if neither man had spoken. There's more. The note alternates between 2 shorthand systems. One belongs to the interpreter's travel accounting. The other switches into the legal trade register used in the signing room. She touched 2 lines on the page. The person he expected at the bridge understood formal document handling, not just transport. The notebook woman stepped closer. May I see that? Dalia handed it over. The woman read fast, lips tightening as she moved down the page. Then she passed it to the silver-haired principal, who scanned it more slowly. Lena? He asked quietly. She shook her head at once. No, my seal case never left my person. Then, after half a beat, she added, except during breakfast service. Mrs. Fenn looked up sharply from Beatrice's side. Breakfast service where? In the East breakfast room, Lena said. We were served coffee there while waiting on the revised schedule. Owen answered before anyone else. The interpreter was present for that service. So was Mr. Cross for a few minutes. Dalia's mind moved quickly now. Breakfast room, seal case unattended, interpreter close enough to observe, maybe to take an impression. Adrian entering briefly, just enough to confirm timing. Reserve courier, Northbridge before dusk. There was planning layered inside planning. If the signing failed openly, they intended to salvage control through forged completion afterward. The legal advisor took off his spectacles and wiped them with a cloth that trembled only slightly. We inventory every delegation document now, every seal, every cover sheet, every authority stamp. Immediately. The silver-haired principal nodded. Do it. One of the other delegates, a quiet man who had spoken little all day, stiffened at that. He had a narrow face, travel-tired eyes, and the kind of forgettable posture people stop noticing after 10 minutes. Dalia noticed him now because he was the only one who did not move at once when the order was given. His name, she remembered from the earlier introductions, was Martin Voss. Logistics support. Mostly silent. Useful in the way background men often are. He gave a small shrug. Surely this is excessive. We already know Cross manipulated the estate. There's no need to insult the delegation by treating us as suspects. Dalia turned toward him, because of the way he'd said them. There are accents, and then there are borrowed registers. Most people hear region. Dalia heard intention. In his earlier remarks, he had spoken in clipped trade English with a northern edge. Just now, under pressure, one phrase had landed in the same formal legal cadence as the note in the interpreter's little book. She had heard that cadence before. Less than an hour ago, when the silver-haired principal challenged the first trust clause. "Please repeat that," she said. Voss frowned. "I said there's no need to insult the delegation." "In your other language," she said. The room shifted again. Adrian watched her now with naked alertness. Voss gave a short laugh. "I beg your pardon?" "The one you used in the hall before we entered the drawing room," Dalia said, "and the one you switched into just now without meaning to." The silver-haired principal looked sharply at his own man. "Martin?" "It's nothing," Voss said. "I speak several trade dialects, as do half the men in shipping." "Yes," Dalia said softly, "but only one of them uses the exact legal phrasing from the interpreter's notes for reserve certification transfer." Lena's notebook snapped shut in her hand. Sebastian whispered, almost to himself, "There were two of them." Voss took a step back, tiny, almost invisible, but everyone saw it because everyone was already watching. The legal advisor's voice turned hard. "Mr. Voss, place your portfolio on the table." He did not move. The silver-haired principal said it again, this time with command behind it. "Now." Slowly, Voss set his leather folio down. He looked annoyed rather than frightened, which in its own way was alarming. Dalia watched his hands. Clean nails, ink on the side of the thumb, a callus where a seal press might rest. He was not just a courier. He handled paper enough to leave marks. "Open it," said the legal advisor. Voss's jaw worked once. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm serious," said Edmund from the chair, voice worn but deadly calm. "For the first time all day, everyone in this house is serious." Voss placed one hand on the clasp. Then Dalia saw it, the slightest glance toward the tall windows, toward the terrace steps slick with rain, toward the U-path that curved away from the south lawn and eventually led, if a man moved fast enough and knew the grounds, toward the north bridge mentioned in the notebook. She did not think. She acted. "Don't let him run," she said. And in the same breath, Martin Voss knocked the folio sideways, sending papers across the carpet, and lunged for the terrace doors. The room exploded before the terrace doors even finished rattling. Martin Voss hit the handles shoulder first, shoved one panel wide, and burst onto the wet stone steps with papers sliding under his shoes. A gust of damp air swept in after him, carrying rain, clipped yew, and the cold mineral smell of the terrace. One of the footmen lunged too late and caught only the edge of Voss's coat. Sebastian was faster than anyone expected. He vaulted over a fallen folio, slammed through the doorway, and went after him without a word. "Don't let Cross move," Edmund barked. That command snapped the room into two battles at once. The legal advisor stepped directly in front of Adrian. The silver-haired principal moved to block the inner doors. Mrs. Fenn, astonishingly steady, pushed the little notebook and conditional transfer instrument farther from reach while Owen gathered the scattered pages with shaking hands. Beatrice stayed by the fire, white-faced but alert, eyes moving from Adrian to Dalia as if she understood that the fight in the rain and the fight at the table were the same fight wearing different clothes. Adrian's expression had sharpened into something ugly now. "This is absurd. You're letting panic run the estate." "No," Dalia said, keeping one hand on the documents. "Panic was this morning. Now we're catching up." He gave her a look stripped of charm. Do you imagine you've won because you can translate a few legal phrases? She met his eyes. I imagine you misjudged who was listening. Outside, the sound of pursuit crashed across the stone. Boots slipping, a curse, the slap of rainwater kicked from the terrace edge. Someone shouted from farther down the lawn. Dalia moved to the doorway but did not leave the papers. From where she stood, she could see Voss cutting across the south path toward the yew walk, his dark coat flashing between wet hedges. Sebastian was behind him, gaining. Groundsman Thomas, broad as a gatepost, had heard the commotion and was already angling in from the stable lane. The estate itself seemed awake around the chase. Servants appeared at distant windows. A groom shouted near the carriage house. Crows rose from the orchard wall. Then Voss did something desperate and stupid. He veered off the gravel path and tried to jump the narrow drainage ditch bordering the yews. His foot hit slick grass instead of stone. He pitched sideways, caught himself on one hand, and lost whatever he had been clutching inside his coat. A small metal object spun across the wet path and struck the base of a planter with a bright, hard click. Sebastian tackled him a second later. Both men went down in the rain. Dalia saw Thomas reach them first. Between the two of them, they had Voss pinned before he could rise again. The object he had dropped lay gleaming on the path, half hidden under wet leaves. A seal press, the legal advisor said behind her. Dalia turned. He had seen it too. So had Adrian. That mattered. His face changed enough. It was the face of a man watching one last piece of leverage roll out of reach. "Bring him in," Edmund called from the chair, voice raw but unbroken. "And bring that object." 2 minutes later, Martin Voss was hauled back into the drawing room soaked through, mud on one knee, collar twisted, breathing hard through his nose. Thomas stayed behind him like a wall. Sebastian came in after them with rain darkening his hair and one sleeve torn at the cuff. He was splattered with wet soil and looked nothing like the polished air from the library. For the first time all day, Dalia saw him without performance. Angry, humiliated, breathing hard, and finally useful. Thomas placed the recovered object on the table. It was a compact seal press with interchangeable dies packed into a velvet-lined metal case no bigger than a cigar tin. One die bore the consortium crest. Another, unfinished, carried only a partial ring impression. A third was blank, ready to be cut or fitted. The silver-haired principal swore under his breath. Lena stepped in close, staring. "That is our old field seal model." The legal advisor's voice went icy. "Retired 2 years ago. How did you get this, Martin?" Voss said nothing. Dalia opened the little case. The hinges squeaked faintly. It smelled of cold brass and damp fabric. Tucked beneath the dies was a thin, folded slip of paper. A simple routing note. Bridge packet only if house version fails. Cross carries consent trail. V carries seal confirmation. There it was. Not a full confession, but enough to weld the pieces together. Voss was the reserve courier. Adrian handled the internal path. The interpreter managed the language screen in the case. If the main signing trap failed, they would assemble a forged completion route outside the estate before dusk. Sebastian stared at Voss. "You were going to fake the consortium's confirmation." Voss lifted his chin despite the mud and the hands on his shoulders. "I was going to protect the deal from sentimental collapse." Beatrice laughed softly at that, and the sound was far more cutting than outrage. "Men always rename greed when they think it sounds impressive." Adrian shifted at last. "You have a frightened support man, a stolen seal tool, and a stack of drafts. That is still not enough to prove what you're implying." Dalia looked at him, then at the press, then back to the hidden compartment's remaining contents. One item had still not been fully examined, the inside flap of the small notebook. She had noticed, when first lifting it, that the cardboard back seemed thicker along one edge. At the time, the chase had interrupted her. Now the pattern tugged at her mind again. She picked it up. Adrian noticed immediately. "What are you doing?" Alarm. That was answer enough. The back cover had warped from damp, causing the glued lining to lift at one corner. Dalia slid her nail under it carefully. The cardboard crackled. A hidden sleeve opened inside the cover, narrow and flat, just large enough to conceal one more paper. Owen whispered, "There's another one." She drew it out. Unlike the other documents, this one was handwritten from top to bottom. Fast, compressed, meant for no clerk's file. A private instruction sheet. The ink had feathered slightly from moisture, but remained legible. Dalia read the first line and felt the last uncertainty collapse. This was the interpreter writing directly to Adrian after the breakfast room meeting. And halfway down the page, beneath a note about the reserve courier and the false seal path, was the sentence that would finish one man and break another. Sebastian never approved full transfer. Proceed through father only. Remove sister protection quietly. That line hit Sebastian like a blow he had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. He did not defend himself this time. He did not argue over wording or intent, or the difference between foolishness and malice. He just stared at the interpreter's hidden note in Dalia's hand, as if the paper had finally said out loud what he had been trying not to hear all day. Adrian had used him, yes, but not cleanly. Not completely. Even inside the fraud, Sebastian had been kept at the edge of the real plan. Edmund saw it too. For the first time since the library, the old man's anger toward his son shifted. It did not vanish. It did not soften, but it changed shape. A father can recognize guilt, and he can also recognize when someone has been vain enough to be manipulated, but not dark enough to design the deepest wound. "Read it again," Edmund said. Dalia did. Sebastian never approved full transfer. Proceed through father only. Remove sister protection quietly. The legal advisor held out his hand. "May I?" She passed him the sheet. He studied it under the lamp, then handed it to the silver-haired principal, who read it with a tightening jaw. Lena took it next, and when her eyes reached the line about the sister, she exhaled sharply through her nose. Martin Voss, still mud-streaked and pinned between Thomas and a footman, looked away. That was almost as telling as a confession. Adrian did not look away. He kept his chin lifted and his face carefully blank, but Dalia could see the effort in it now. He had lost the elegant rhythm of control. Every new piece forced him to react before he could shape the room around himself. "That note proves nothing final," he said. "It proves only that a frightened interpreter was recording his own confused impressions." "No," Dalia said. "It proves he understood you were pushing past what Sebastian agreed to." Adrian turned on her. "And now you're a mind reader too?" She met him calmly. "No, just literate." That landed harder than a shouted accusation could have, because everyone in the room remembered the library, the labels, the laughter, the threat to dismiss her. Humiliation had lit the fuse, and now every careful page she read was another step toward vindication before the household. No one said the phrase aloud. They didn't need to. It was in the room like heat. Beatrice spoke next, her voice quiet enough to make the others lean in. "If Sebastian never approved the full transfer, then you needed Edmund's name on the line before the real document could be finished." She looked straight at Adrian. "And you needed me reduced to a technical obstacle." Adrian said nothing. Edmund's cane tapped the carpet once. "Answer her." Still nothing. The silence stretched just long enough to become its own answer. Outside, the rain had eased to a thin silver drift across the terrace glass. Inside, the fire had burned lower, and the room smelled of damp wool, cold coffee, wet leather, and old paper. Dalia stood in the middle of it, one hand still resting near the contract stack, and felt the pace of the day changing again. The biggest lies were already exposed. What mattered now was what could still be salvaged. The silver-haired principal folded the note once, carefully. "The consortium will not sign any document prepared under this chain of corruption." The words dropped like a stone. Sebastian shut his eyes briefly. Owen made a soft sound of despair. Even Mrs. Fenn looked stricken, because whatever happened now, the servants would feel it first. If the deal died, wages would wither, repairs would stop, rooms would close, and people who had served the Hales for decades would be thanked and dismissed with polite ruin. Adrian saw that fear spread and tried to seize it. "There," he said at once, "there is your real consequence. Tear everything up and the estate collapses. Your orchards are underperforming, your docks need money, your family is fractured, and your guests will leave with a scandal instead of a contract. You may hate my methods, but I was the only one offering a workable structure." Dalia turned to the silver-haired principal before Edmund or Sebastian could answer. She switched into his own language, clean and precise, and asked one question. "If the fraudulent structure were removed entirely," she said, "would your consortium still consider the underlying trade itself sound?" The man looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Yes," he said, "but only if the true family authority is clear, the beneficiary rights are corrected, and the revised control language is explained without ambiguity in every operative language." Dalia nodded once and translated that back for the room. Hope arrived carefully. The legal advisor added, "And we would need a fresh version drafted in front of witnesses, with no reliance on the missing interpreter's summaries or on any annex prepared by Cross." Sebastian looked from him to Dalia. "Could that even be done today?" Before she answered, she looked at the papers already spread across the table, the original route terms, the tariff file, the Schedule B recovered from the envelope, the conditional transfer instrument that had exposed the trap, the notes, the false seal case. The rotten branches were obvious now, but the trunk of the deal, the shipping lanes, the freight volumes, the orchard output schedule, the mutual profit terms, those were still there under all the poison. "Yes," she said, "if we strip it down to the original commercial core." The legal advisor frowned. "That would still require multilingual clarification and corrected beneficiary drafting." "I know. And time. I know that too." Sebastian stared at her as if he still could not understand how the maid from the library had become the only voice in the house speaking with any useful certainty. "You think you can rebuild it?" Dalia did not answer immediately, because in that instant, another memory cut through the room of a narrow port stairwell years ago, wet laundry dripping from a rail, voices from 3 apartments calling her name at once, one neighbor needing medicine instructions translated, another arguing over dock weights, a third begging her to read a letter before rent was due. That was where this had been forged. Not in schoolrooms, not in polished offices. In survival, in speed, in the stubborn refusal to let important meanings stay trapped behind words other people used as walls. She came back to the room and said, "Yes, but only if everyone stops lying." Adrian laughed once, brittle now. "You expect them to hand a fortune's future to a housemaid because she speaks 10 logos?" Edmund answered before Dalia could. "Yes," he said, "if that housemaid is the only honest mind left in the room." Then he turned to Dalia fully, and what he asked next changed the shape of the day all over again. "Can you lead the redraft," he said, "and save this estate before sunset?" Edmund's question hung in the room like a bell that had already been struck. "Can you lead the redraft and save this estate before sunset?" Dalia felt every eye turned to her again. Family, staff, guests, traders, witnesses. A few hours earlier, those same eyes had watched Sebastian mock her over a bottle label. Now the whole house was balanced on whether the maid he called illiterate could rebuild in one afternoon what greed, pride, and carelessness had nearly ruined. She did not answer quickly, because she knew what she could read. She knew that part. The challenge was larger now. This was no longer a test of 10 languages or hidden brilliance alone. It was architecture, trust structure, inheritance protection, shipping schedules, liability terms, and human nerves fraying on all sides. Then she looked at Beatrice. The older woman sat very still beside the fire, pale but composed, her shawl gathered in both hands. The quiet steadiness in her face took Dalia back, in one sharp private flash, to another room years ago. Thin walls, damp stair rail, the sour smell of boiled cabbage and harbor smoke. Her grandmother setting down a pot with one hand while dictating a rent appeal in broken formal language to a neighbor who could barely sign her own name. Dalia had been small then, feet not reaching the floor, pencil stub gripped tight, translating between fear and paperwork, because if she got the words wrong, somebody slept hungry. That was where her gift had been forged. In rooms where mistakes cost people their place in the world. She came back to the drawing room and said, "Yes, but I need conditions." Adrian gave a short, disbelieving sound. Even now, he could not hide his contempt for the sight of a servant setting terms. Edmund ignored him completely. "What conditions?" he asked. "No one leaves," Dalia said. "Not Adrian, not Voss, not anyone from the delegation unless the principals agree. Every draft stays on this table. We work only from original commercial terms and witnessed notes. Beatrice's protection is written first, not patched in later. Every clause that carries authority or money gets read aloud in each relevant language before it is accepted." The legal advisor answered before anyone else. "Reasonable." The silver-haired principal nodded. "Agreed." Sebastian said quietly, "Anything else?" "Yes." She looked directly at him. "You do not speak for the room unless you are asked." He accepted that with a stiff nod. That, more than apology, told her he had begun to understand the scale of what he had broken. The room moved fast after that. The long contract table was cleared of everything except the clean originals, the recovered schedule, ink, fresh paper, and the evidence set aside under the watch of the legal advisor and Mrs. Fenn. Thomas kept Voss by the inner doors. Adrian remained where he was, no longer charming, no longer useful, with the silver-haired principal's second man standing close enough to prevent theatrics. Owen was dispatched to fetch blank ledger sheets, carbon paper, and the old maritime route maps from the estate office. Lena unpacked the consortium's verified reference folder. Mrs. Fenn ordered tea, lamps, and dry cloths with the same voice she might have used to command dinner service. Only now, in the storm of preparation, did Dalia seem to become more still. Such was her rhythm. When others rushed, she narrowed. She began with the commercial core, freight volume, orchard output schedules, port handling windows, seasonal storage guarantees. Those were clean enough. Cross and the interpreter had not needed to poison the visible promise of the deal. They had hidden the theft in authority mechanisms around it. Dalia read each section, translated key terms across the table, then stopped where phrasing blurred into legal leverage. The silver-haired principal tested her twice, asking whether a weather delay allowance in one language carried the same commercial burden in another. She answered precisely and corrected one phrase that would have shifted liability for spoiled fruit onto the estate, even in ordinary storm delay. The man's eyes narrowed in respect. Then Lena challenged her with a custom certification term buried in a side paragraph about bonded holding periods. Dalia did not even look at the glossary first. "If you keep that wording," she said, "your inspectors can classify routine storage as irregular dwell time and trigger unnecessary penalty review." She translated the term 3 ways, then gave the practical version. "Use the plain storage phrase. It matches actual handling." Lena stared at her for half a second, and then crossed out the original wording herself. Dalia felt it, the room changing through reliance. No one was humoring her. No one was indulging the novelty of the maid with 10 languages. They were following her because she was right, again and again and again. Hours seemed to compress. Rain light dulled toward afternoon. Lamps were lit. Steam rose from untouched tea. Pages accumulated in neat stacks. Edmund spoke only when family authority required his voice. Beatrice reviewed the beneficiary language beside him and, with astonishing clarity, insisted on one correction to the phrasing of her secured status. Owen wrote as fast as his cramped hand allowed. Sebastian stood back, silent as ordered, but when she asked for an old route valuation from 2 seasons earlier, He found it in under a minute without argument. Dalia marked the redraft in layers: commercial terms, dispute procedure, verified authority line, protected family beneficiary clause, explicit exclusion of private trustee substitution, direct multilingual annex references, no shadow language, no loose attachment points, no room for a mistranslated clause to creep back in under polite wording. The legal advisor looked over one page and said, almost to himself, "This is cleaner than the first structure we brought." Adrian heard that, and that, more than the evidence, seemed to unsettle him. Because exposure was one kind of defeat. Watching the intended victim produce something stronger than his scheme, that was another. He leaned forward from his guarded place. "You're all forgetting the simplest problem. Even if she rebuilds the paper, the consortium still has to trust the estate's leadership. Why would they sign with a family this divided?" The question landed because it was not foolish. It was the one real obstacle left. The silver-haired principal folded his hands. "He's right about that much. We need certainty of operating authority." Edmund looked tired suddenly. Old. The work of the day had carved years into his face. Beatrice saw it too. Dalia's eyes moved from Edmund to Sebastian, then back to the draft in front of her. There was a solution. Not a sentimental one, but a workable one. She began writing a new operational clause by hand in the margin first, before allowing Owen to copy it clean. Temporary for trade execution only. Transparent, reviewable, family secured, delegation verified. It would preserve Edmund's dignity, protect Beatrice, stop Adrian's route entirely, and force Sebastian into accountability instead of uncontrolled command. When she finished the rough language, she looked up. "I have the structure," she said. Edmund's voice was almost a whisper. "Read it." And as Dalia drew breath to speak the clause that could save them all, Adrian Cross smiled for the first time in nearly an hour, as if he had just noticed one word in her draft that everyone else had missed. Adrian's smile was small, but Dalia saw it clearly. Dalia saw recognition. He had spotted a weakness, or thought he had. The room was too tired, too charged, too desperate for a solution to notice the tiny shift in his mouth, but she noticed. She had spent too many years listening to people who thought they were cleverer than they were. A man only smiled like that when he believed someone else had made a mistake he could turn into a weapon later. "Read it," Edmund said again. Dalia kept her eyes on Adrian for one beat longer, then lowered them to the clause she had written in the margin. Her voice stayed level. "For the duration of execution and first quarter route stabilization, commercial operating authority shall remain with Edmund Hale as principal signatory, with Sebastian Hale acting as declared secondary executor under witnessed family limitation. No external private trustee, surrogate authority, or annexed substitute may be recognized without direct ratification by all named protected beneficiaries and the consortium's chief legal office." The legal advisor nodded slowly as she went. She continued, "Protected family beneficiary status for Beatrice Hale shall be affirmed in the primary body of agreement and mirrored in every operative annex. Any dispute regarding route performance, delayed yield, or temporary incapacity may suspend profit release schedules, but shall not alter beneficiary protection, estate title, or family control." She finished and looked up. Silence. It was working silence, the kind that comes when hard people are testing a thing and finding it stronger than expected. Then Lena said, "That closes the trustee path." "Yes," said the legal advisor. "And it prevents the beneficiary category from being shifted into an attachment later." The silver-haired principal tapped one finger on the table. "It also leaves operational continuity in place while forcing internal accountability. That part matters." Sebastian, who had said almost nothing for the last stretch of the redraft, looked at the page like a man seeing his own future written in terms he had not earned. Secondary executor, limited authority, witnessed family limitation. Not the power he once imagined, but not ruin either. Adrian's smile returned. "There," he said softly, "that word." Dalia did not move. Which one? Ratification. The legal advisor frowned. What about it? Adrian leaned back as far as Thomas would let him. In one language, your version means direct approval. In another, under commercial inheritance practice, it can be argued to mean acknowledgement after the fact. If a dispute lands before a hostile reader, that difference matters. The room tightened all at once. For a brief, dangerous second, it looked as if Adrian had found a crack. The silver-haired principal turned to Dalia. Is he right? She did not answer immediately. Because he was right, in the narrowest, ugliest way. The base English was solid, but if translated loosely into one of the operating versions used by the consortium's regional offices, the term could be stretched. Not enough to revive Adrian's whole scheme, enough to start a future quarrel in the hands of a determined parasite. And that, Dalia realized, was exactly the level at which men like him liked to survive. By leaving one poisoned pin in the cloth so the fabric rotted slowly after everyone went home. She took up the pen again. Yes, she said. He's right about the vulnerability. He's wrong about what it means. Then she crossed out the single word. Owen looked up from his copying sheet. What are you replacing it with? She wrote as she spoke. Express contemporaneous assent in signed multi-party form. The legal advisor's brows rose. Lena gave a short, impressed breath. The silver-haired principal smiled for the first time since the storm began. That, he said, cannot be bent. Dalia translated the replacement phrase across the working languages one by one, not just literally, but functionally, showing how each version closed the interpretive gap Adrian had pounced on. In one tongue, she chose the legal form used in bonded port arbitration. In another, she used the exact registry phrase for same-day witnessed consent. In a third, she rejected the elegant literary term in favor of the blunt trade office wording nobody could romantically misread later. This was the central engine of the whole day now. It was examination. Every phrase tested, every hidden hinge checked. The audience that had once been the household was now joined by the delegation, the staff, the family, even the captured conspirators. And the woman Sebastian had mocked was standing in the center of it, controlling it. Still, Dalia kept moving. She revised the dispute clause, the yield timing, the bonded storage language, the annex references. She made Beatrice's protected status appear in the main agreement, not buried in schedules. She added a certification line requiring all operative translations to be read aloud and confirmed before signature. She created a cross-reference lock so no future attachment could alter authority without breaking the document's own internal logic. At one point, the legal advisor challenged a customs release phrase. She answered him in his own technical register and then translated back for Edmund in language plain enough to taste. At another point, Lena questioned whether the estate's weather loss language remained commercially fair. Dalia recalibrated the phrasing so storm delays would pause penalty exposure without excusing false inventory claims. The silver-haired principal asked one final hard question. If Edmund becomes ill in the coming quarter, who acts? Before Dalia could answer, Sebastian spoke from across the table, careful now, stripped of swagger. Not me alone. Everyone turned. He swallowed once. If this is to hold, then my authority must be review-bound. My aunt remains protected. My father remains principal. And any quarter execution I handle is witnessed and reported to both the family and the consortium. Edmund looked at his son for a long time. Dalia saw what passed between them then. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something like the first narrow bridge toward it. She nodded and wrote the adjustment in. That should have been enough. It would have been enough, except for one thing. When Owen recopied the finalized clause stack onto the clean sheets, Dalia noticed his hand pause over one line. Just a flicker, just enough to catch her eye. What is it? She asked. He looked up, face gone pale again. This reference number. She stepped around the table and bent over the page beside him. He pointed to the cross-reference code she had used to lock the authority clause to the beneficiary protection line. "It's not wrong," he said quickly. "It's impossible." The room quieted. "Impossible how?" asked the legal advisor. Owen wet his lips. "Because that code already exists in the estate registry." Dalia felt a cold thread move through her. "Where?" she asked. Owen looked from her to Edmund, then to the black notebook, then back to the fresh page under his hand. "In your mother's sealed trust papers," he said. "The ones no one has opened since she died." Owen's words stopped the room in a new way. With the strange chill that comes when the past reaches into the present and lays a hand on the table. Edmund looked up slowly. "My wife's trust papers?" Owen nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir. They were indexed years ago under a locked family code series. I only know because I copied the old registry shelf list last winter when the West Archive leaked. That reference number," he pointed to the fresh clause Dalia had drafted. "It belongs to Lady Hale's sealed instruments set. No one uses that series anymore." Sebastian stared. "Why wouldn't anyone have told us?" Mrs. Fenn answered from near the fire, and her voice carried the weight of old household memory. "Because after your mother died, your father ordered those papers left untouched unless family necessity demanded otherwise." She looked at Edmund, not unkindly. "I'd say necessity has arrived." The old man shut his eyes for a brief second, as if the mention of his wife had reached somewhere the day's chaos had not. When he opened them again, they were wet but sharp. "Where are they?" "In the West Archive strongbox," Owen said. "Second shelf behind the ledger presses. I can bring them." "Go," Edmund said. Owen did not wait for a second command. He ran. The drawing room held its breath while he was gone. The fire settled low with a soft crack. Rainwater slipped from the terrace roof in a thin silver thread. Adrian said nothing now. That was wise. Martin Voss stood pinned and silent, mud drying on his trouser leg. Even the delegates seemed to understand that whatever came next might not just save the contract. It might explain why this family had been vulnerable in exactly the way Adrian had tried to exploit. Dalia looked down at her draft and understood the danger immediately. If her new clause duplicated an old protected code already embedded in Lady Hale's private trust, then there were two possibilities. Either she had stumbled blindly into a family safeguard she did not yet understand, or Adrian already knew about that safeguard and had built his scheme specifically to bypass it. When Owen returned, he was carrying a flat black document box with brass corners and a stiff red ribbon tied around it. He set it on the table with both hands as if it weighed far more than paper should. Dust marked the lid. One corner smelled faintly of cellar damp and old leather. Edmund touched the box once before speaking. "I sealed this after Claire died." Sebastian went still at the use of his mother's name. Beatrice lowered her eyes. Mrs. Fenn made the sign of a small, private memory across her apron with her thumb. The legal advisor stepped back half a pace. This was family ground now, even if the business consequences still belonged to everyone. Edmund untied the ribbon himself. His fingers trembled only once. Inside lay 3 folded instruments, a personal letter in a cream envelope, and an index sheet in Claire Hale's own hand, elegant, disciplined, unmistakably written by someone who expected her papers to outlive her voice. Dalia did not touch anything until Edmund nodded permission. The first instrument was simple property continuity language. The second covered charitable endowments and staff pensions. The third made her pulse jump before she finished the heading. Protective contingent authority in the event of coercive commercial restructuring. The room sharpened around her. She read faster, then slower. Claire Hale had anticipated something. Not Adrian, not this exact trap, but the kind of trap. She had written a dormant protective framework to activate if a state authority were ever pressured through illness, inheritance confusion, or outside financial manipulation. And there, halfway down, under the same code Owen had recognized, was the reason Beatrice had become such a target. Beatrice's protected status was the lock. So long as her beneficiary protection remained intact, no external trustee could gain controlling interim authority over the estate's trade assets without unanimous family acknowledgement. Adrian knew it. That was why the scheme had been built around quietly stripping her protection first. Dalia looked up at him. For the first time all afternoon, he looked truly cornered. Sebastian saw it too. "You found my mother's safeguard," he said, voice low with disbelief. "And instead of telling us, you built around it." Adrian gave a humorless little smile. "Your mother built a sentimental obstruction." "No," Dalia said. "She built a firewall." She turned the page and found something even more useful. Claire had anticipated disputes over translation and interpretation in foreign trade settings. She had included a fallback mechanism. If a commercial agreement threatened family protection through ambiguous language, the estate could invoke protective contingent authority and issue a corrective rider without reopening the entire negotiation, provided the rider was witnessed, read aloud, and accepted by all operating parties in the same sitting. The legal advisor stepped in closer. "Can that rider still be used?" Dalia read the final conditions carefully. "Yes, if Edmund invokes it personally, Beatrice affirms her standing, the consortium consents, and the corrective language is attached before signature." The silver-haired principal answered at once. "If that rider is clean, we consent." Hope moved through the room so suddenly it almost hurt. Sebastian gripped the back of a chair. Beatrice whispered Claire's name under her breath. Mrs. Fenn pressed a hand to her mouth, just for a moment, then recovered herself and started moving inkstands into order, as if efficiency could hold emotion in place. Dalia placed Claire Hale's protective instrument beside her own redraft. The fit was almost eerie. The clause she had written from instinct and trade logic aligned with the dead woman's buried safeguard, as if two minds separated by years had reached for the same defense from opposite ends. Then she saw the final line on the last page. Her breath caught. It was written in Claire's hand below the formal text, added as a private instruction to the sealed set. "If my son is ever vain enough to be led, let him be corrected without being destroyed." Dalia lifted her eyes to Sebastian. He looked as if someone had opened a window inside his chest. But the line beneath that was the one that truly changed the next move. "If no trustworthy family reader remains when this is opened, seek the plainest, honest voice in the room, and let that voice read for us." Before anyone could react, the front drive bell rang again, sharp and urgent through the house. And the butler, appearing breathless at the door, said, "There's a messenger from the village office, with a sworn statement from the missing interpreter." The butler had barely finished speaking before the room shifted again. Another messenger, another paper, another chance for the day to tilt. "Bring him in," Edmund said. The messenger turned out to be the village solicitor's clerk, a thin young man in a wet cap with his coat darkened from the rain, and a sealed packet clutched under his arm so tightly his knuckles had blanched. Mud flecked his trouser hems. He smelled of road water, horse sweat, and cheap sealing wax. He bowed too quickly to the room, then held out the packet. "This was left at Mr. Wilkes's office less than an hour ago," he said. The man who delivered it claimed he was acting for the interpreter and insisted it be handed only to a principal witness if trouble arose at the estate. The legal advisor took the packet first, checked the seal, and held it up for all to see. "Opened in company." Dalia watched Adrian while the flap was cut. He looked irritated. That mattered. If the missing interpreter had sent a statement at the last moment, Adrian had either not expected it or had expected it to say something else. The silver-haired principal seemed to reach the same conclusion. His eyes never left Cross. Inside the packet were 3 folded sheets and 1 short notarized cover note from the village solicitor, confirming that the enclosed declaration had been signed voluntarily by a man identifying himself as the interpreter employed for the Hale transaction. Just enough to make the statement admissible as common sense in a room full of frightened people. The legal advisor scanned the first page, then handed it to Dalia. "Read." She read silently at first, then her face changed, with that colder thing she had worn all afternoon whenever the pieces finally clicked into place. "What does it say?" Sebastian asked. Dalia lifted the page and began. The interpreter's statement was messy, rushed, and clearly written by a man trying to save himself before nightfall. He admitted that Adrian Cross had approached him days earlier with an offer of extra payment to simplify the Hale contract package. He admitted preparing softened summaries, resealing files, and withholding Schedule B. He admitted coordinating with Martin Voss as reserve courier if the primary signing trap failed. He admitted that the false seal case found in the pump house was part of a backup plan to attach corrected certification pages after departure if the household raised objections before the signature. She translated the key parts for the delegates as she went, line by line, and nobody interrupted. Then came the section that changed Adrian's posture completely. The interpreter wrote that he had grown frightened when he discovered one crucial fact too late. Adrian had never intended to preserve Sebastian as future heir in any meaningful way. Once temporary control shifted under the conditional transfer route, Sebastian was to be discredited as unstable, commercially reckless, and compromised by private notes already obtained from his own study. The statement named the black notebook, the note hidden behind the calling card, and a second bundle of copied personal letters meant to be used against him if needed. Sebastian went white. Adrian stopped pretending. "He was panicking," he snapped. "He'll say anything to avoid prison." "Maybe," said Dalia, and kept reading. There was more. The interpreter wrote that he had taken the case to the pump house because he had realized the plan had expanded beyond fraud into ruin. He claimed Adrian meant to force Edmund's signature before sunset, isolate Beatrice as an emotional complication, use Voss to fabricate post-signing certification, and then pressure the consortium into accepting a fait accompli built on already executed authority. Most devastating of all, he wrote that the reserve bridge handoff was timed for dusk because that was when the family would still be arguing internally while guests prepared to depart. "He built the whole day around our confusion," Beatrice said softly. "Yes," Dalia answered. The clerk from the village solicitor shifted from foot to foot, clearly wishing himself elsewhere. "There is a final page," he said quietly. Mr. Wilkes marked it as urgent. The legal advisor unfolded it. This last sheet was shorter and written in a different tone, more precise, almost ashamed. The interpreter said he had left one duplicate packet hidden not in the pump house, not with Voss, but in the village office itself, under instruction to release it only if the woman from the house who truly reads survived the day's attack on language. He did not know Dalia's name. He described her only that way. The room went still again. Edmund closed his eyes briefly. Mrs. Fenn let out a breath that sounded almost like grief and pride mixed together. Sebastian looked at Dalia as if he had no vocabulary left for what he was witnessing. The legal advisor read the release note attached to that line. The duplicate packet contains corrected source language copies, the interpreter's fee note from Cross, and an unsigned memorandum explaining the intended use of the family trust weakness. The silver-haired principal straightened. "Can it be fetched before sunset?" The young clerk nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Mr. Wilkes sent me ahead to ask whether he should dispatch a rider." "Dispatch one," Edmund said immediately. Adrian laughed once, but there was fear in it now. "You're all very impressed by paper. The estate still doesn't have a signed agreement." "That changes tonight," said Dalia. She turned back to the redraft and to Claire Hale's protective instrument. The missing duplicate packet would strengthen the case against Adrian and Voss, yes. But the contract itself could not wait for one more ride down one more wet road. Sunset was approaching. The household needed final text now, so she resumed. She integrated Claire's protective contingent authority as a formal corrective rider. She placed Beatrice's status in the main body and mirrored it in annex references. She inserted the multi-party assent phrase that Adrian had tried to exploit. She locked commercial execution to witnessed family continuity. She forced every operating language to say the same thing with no room for a future parasite to interpret what had already been spoken clearly in the room. The legal advisor approved one section, then another. Lena signed off on the customs phrasing. The silver-haired principal accepted the route volume table. Even Sebastian, when asked for a storage valuation figure from last quarter, produced it without comment and without trying to lead. At last, only one unresolved line remained. Who exactly would execute quarter operations if Edmund's strength failed before the next review? The room knew the answer could not simply be Sebastian alone. Not after today. Not with his note already in evidence, however manipulated. But the estate also could not function leaderless. Someone had to hold the bridge between authority and trust. Dalia looked down at the draft, then at Claire's sealed instruction again. Seek the plainest, honest voice in the room. A thought came to her then, practical, bold, dangerous in the way truth often is in houses built on hierarchy. She wrote one more name into the operational oversight line. Sebastian saw it first. His head snapped up. Her? He said. Sebastian's voice cracked through the room before anyone else could answer. Her? He was staring at the line Dalia had just written into the operational oversight clause, as if the ink itself had shocked him. The lamp beside the contract stack threw a clean gold light over the page, and there, in plain script, sat the role she had added. Independent language and foreign accounts witness to execution, reporting jointly to Edmund Hale, Beatrice Hale, and the consortium's legal office for the first quarter of operations. Not owner, not heir, not trustee, witness, reader, protector against hidden wording. Dalia met Sebastian's stare without flinching. Yes, me. Adrian laughed once, low and cutting. Now we arrive at the real ambition. No, Beatrice said before Dalia could speak. Now we arrive at the real necessity. That silenced him for a beat. The old woman straightened in her chair, shawl slipping slightly from one shoulder, her eyes brighter than Dalia had seen them all day. You all heard Claire's instruction. If no trustworthy family reader remained, the plainest, honest voice in the room was to read for us. Well, she looked directly at Edmund. That voice has been standing in front of us since morning while the rest of us were still trapped in our own assumptions. Edmund's hand tightened around the arm of the chair. He looked at the line, then at Dalia, then at Sebastian. It would witness it, he said slowly. Yes, Dalia answered, and it would make another Adrian impossible. The legal advisor leaned over the clause and read it in silence. Then he nodded. From the consortium's side, that strengthens trust rather than weakens it. We need a clean reader attached to the agreement's life after signing. Lena added, and someone who can verify that no later translation drifts from what we approved today. The silver-haired principal looked from Dalia to the draft again. Would you actually do it? That question landed differently from the others, an offer edged in responsibility. For one moment, Dalia felt the ghost of the old instinct rise in her, the instinct to step back, to say she was only staff, only helping, only passing through the center of other people's power. But that instinct had built her life in narrow corridors and borrowed rooms. It had helped her survive. It would not be enough now. If the family accepts the truth of what happened today, she said, and if this role exists to protect clarity rather than flatter me, then yes. Sebastian lowered his eyes to the table. When he looked up again, something in him had changed for good. I accept it, he said. If my name remains anywhere in this agreement, it should remain under someone who can read what I failed to see. No one mistook that for nobility. It was better than that. It was honest. Edmund exhaled, long and tired. Then the role stands. Adrian's face hardened into open contempt. You are handing estate oversight to a maid. No, said Edmund. I am handing it to the most competent person in my house. That might have been enough to carry the next step, but the day had not yet finished giving up its secrets. From the front drive came the rapid clatter of hooves on wet stone. A few seconds later, another servant appeared in the doorway with a leather dispatch tube in both hands and rainwater dripping from his sleeves. "The rider from the village office, sir. Mr. Wilkes sent the duplicate packet." The tube was set on the table and opened at once. Inside lay the promised duplicates, corrected source language pages, a fee note signed by the interpreter, and a folded memorandum in Adrian's hand. The fee note was bad enough. It listed extra payment for priority handling, tied to altered summaries and emergency routing. But the memorandum was worse because it was written for no audience except a co-conspirator. Dalia opened it, read the first lines, and passed it straight to the legal advisor. He read aloud this time. "If primary signature obtained, activate family displacement through B revision and interim authority transfer. If younger Hale hesitates, proceed through father. Preserve plausible deniability regarding full removal. No metaphor, no softening, no escape hatch." Martin Voss shut his eyes. Adrian did not. Sebastian listened without moving. Then the legal advisor turned the page over. On the back was the final useful detail. A short instruction that the consortium's seal confirmation was to be backdated after departure if objections arose before dinner. That meant the false path was not hypothetical. It had a timetable. The silver-haired principal placed both palms on the table. "That settles it. Cross and Voss are removed from every aspect of this negotiation. Their names appear nowhere in the final text. Their materials stay under witness." Thomas tightened his grip on Voss's shoulder. A footman moved nearer Adrian without being told. At last, finally, the room was free of argument, free of doubt. The revised agreement was recopied onto clean sheets. Claire Hale's protective rider was integrated and witnessed. Beatrice's status appeared in the primary body and in mirrored annex language. Sebastian's authority remained limited, review-bound, and visible. Dalia's new oversight role sat exactly where it needed to sit, as a lock no one in this house would ever again pretend not to need. Owen sanded the final page with trembling care. Lena checked the customs lines one last time. The legal advisor reviewed the authority clauses. The silver-haired principal approved the route schedule. Edmund read the family sections himself. Beatrice read them too. At the end, only one act remained. Signature. Edmund's pen was brought. The silver tray beneath it gleamed in the lamplight. Outside, the last rain was fading and dusk pressed blue against the windows. Dalia stood at the head of the table with the final document in her hands. "Before anyone signs," she said, "I will read the operative clauses aloud once more in every required language." No one objected. She began. One version, then the next, then the next. Her voice moved across the room with total command now. Trade, law, inheritance, duty, protection, consequence. The house that had laughed at her in the morning listened in complete silence by evening. When she reached the final consent line and lifted her head, Edmund was already reaching for the pen, just as Adrian Cross said very softly, "Check the witness line." Adrian's warning cut through the room so quietly that, for one dangerous heartbeat, it almost sounded helpful. Check the witness line. Edmund's pen stopped just above the page. Every muscle in Dalia's back tightened. She hated that he had spoken at exactly the right moment, because men like Adrian survived by making truth feel theatrical and correction feel petty. But she had not come this far by dismissing details out of pride. If there was one more needle hidden in the cloth, she would find it before it tore anything else open. She lowered the document flat again and moved to the final page. The witness block looked clean at first glance. Edmund Hale, principal signatory, the silver-haired principal for the consortium, the chief legal witness line. Beatrice's protected beneficiary acknowledgement, Sebastian's limited executor acknowledgement, Dalia's oversight witness line. All of it in proper order, sanded and recopied on fresh paper, clear enough that no one could later claim confusion. And yet Adrian was still smiling. Not broadly, not triumphantly, just enough to say, "You're tired, you'll miss it." Dalia bent lower. The paper smelled of ink, warm lamp oil, and the dry dust of the old archive box. She ran her finger down the witness language once in English, then once in the second operating version, then again in the third. Her eyes moved not over the names this time, but over the verbs tied to them. There, one tiny shift, not in Edmund's line, not in the consortium's, in Sebastian's acknowledgement. The English version said he accepted limited executor status under witnessed family limitation. The third language version, used in one regional enforcement office tied to port disputes, carried a phrasing that could be read as pre-existing execution authority acknowledged, rather than newly bounded authority accepted. Adrian had not planted the error now. It had slipped in during the final copy pass, almost certainly through fatigue. But if signed, it would leave one last splinter in the future. She looked up. "He's right," she said. A low, collective breath moved through the room. Sebastian went pale again. Edmund's jaw set. The legal advisor stepped in without waiting. "Where?" Dalia pointed to the translated witness line and read it aloud in the original legal trade register, then translated the practical effect back into plain English. In this version, Sebastian is not merely accepting a limited role. He is being described as someone whose authority already exists and is merely being witnessed. Sebastian shut his eyes. "Which means?" "Which means," said the legal advisor grimly, "that a future hostile reader could argue the limitation recognizes pre-existing executor power rather than creating a bound role from this signing forward." Adrian spread his hands as if to say, "There it is." But Dalia had already taken up the pen. "That won't stand," she said. She struck the phrase cleanly, one decisive line, no trembling, and replaced it with tighter wording in all active versions. "Accepts bounded quarter authority only as created by this instrument and subject to contemporaneous family and consortium witness." The legal advisor checked it at once. Lena checked it after him. The silver-haired principal read it last, then gave a hard nod. "Now it's sealed," he said. Adrian's smile vanished. That was the moment he understood he had run out of corners, because the one person he had treated as invisible kept catching every remaining path. Dalia set the pen down and looked across the table. "Anything else?" No one answered immediately. Then, to everyone's surprise, Sebastian did. "Yes," he said, voice low. "There's one more thing." The room turned toward him. He did not look at Adrian. He looked at Edmund first, then at Beatrice, and finally at Dalia. "My acknowledgement should come after hers," he said, nodding toward his aunt. "Not before. If today proved anything, it's that the family order I kept assuming was natural wasn't." Beatrice stared at him. So did Edmund. Dalia studied the page, then nodded. "He's right." A small adjustment, just a shifted line in a witness order, yet it changed the moral architecture of the page. The vulnerable family member who had nearly been erased would now be visibly secured before the heir acknowledged anything at all. Mrs. Fenn made a soft sound that might have been approval. The order was corrected. The page was recopied one final time. Fresh sand dusted the ink. The butler changed the lamp wick because dusk had deepened fully, and the windows now reflected the room back at itself. Faces, flame, paper, strain. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, Adrian and Voss stood under watch with nowhere left to go. The duplicate packet from the village office lay beside Claire Hale's protective instrument and the exposed fraud documents. The false seal press sat shut in its little metal case like a dead insect. The final agreement rested at the center of the table, cleaner than the first draft, stronger than the original plan, and protected on every side by witnesses who now understood exactly what they were doing. Dalia read the operative clauses aloud one last time. Each language, each authority line, each beneficiary protection, each quarter execution safeguard. No decorative flourishes, No softened promises, just meaning, exact and locked. When she finished, the room held still for a moment that seemed larger than the house itself. The silver-haired principal stepped forward first and placed his hand beside the document. "From our side," he said, "this is ready." The legal advisor nodded. "Legally sound," Lena added, "operationally clear." Beatrice laid her fingertips on the table edge, eyes shining now, but steady. "For the family, I accept." Sebastian swallowed once. "So do I." At last, Edmund reached for the pen again. This time, no one interrupted. He signed. The scratch of nib on paper sounded louder than any speech that day. He passed the pen to the silver-haired principal, then to Beatrice, next to Sebastian, next to the legal advisor for witness confirmation. The stack moved exactly as it should, hands steadying, pages turning, names landing one after another in wet black lines. Only one signature remained before the document could close, Dalia's. She looked at the line written for her, Foreign Accounts and Language Oversight Witness, and for the first time all day, her hand hesitated, from the weight of what it meant. And just as the pen was offered to her, the front doors of the estate opened somewhere beyond the corridor, followed by a burst of hurried voices, and a woman's cry from the hall. "Wait, don't sign that yet!" It was urgency sharpened by age. A woman in a dark traveling coat appeared at the drawing room doors, breathless, silver hair damp at the temples, one gloved hand gripping a leather folio to her chest. The butler hurried behind her, apologizing for the intrusion, but she did not stop for him. She looked straight at Edmund Hale. "You cannot finish that document in the order you're using," she said. Claire made sure of it. For one stunned second, nobody moved. Then Beatrice rose halfway from her chair. Agnes? So that was who she was. Agnes Rowan, the retired village registrar who had witnessed Claire Hale's sealed family instruments years earlier. Her face was older now, lined and wind-cut, but her voice still had the clean authority of a woman who had spent a lifetime stopping other people's sloppiness before it became law. She crossed the room, opened her folio, and laid a thin witness ledger beside the final agreement. "I was at Wilkes's office when the second packet came in," she said, catching her breath. "The clerk mentioned you had reopened Claire's protective file. I remembered there was one final notation in my witness register that never went into the family box because Claire asked me to keep it separate until necessity forced it into daylight." Dalia looked down at the entry. The handwriting was Claire's, short, direct, meant to close a loophole before any future parasite found it. In the event the protective rider is activated through necessity, the independent reader must sign before blood heirs, so that no one may later claim the voice was added after consent. Adrian's face went flat. That was what he had been reaching for. If Dalia signed last, a future challenge could argue that her oversight role had been ornamental, attached after the family had already consented. Claire had seen that possibility years before anyone in this room imagined this day. She had built one final lock, and Agnes Rowan had just carried the key through the rain. The legal advisor read the notation, then nodded. "She's right. If we want this impregnable, the witness order changes." Edmund set the pen down and turned to Dalia. His voice was tired, but there was no hesitation left in it. "Then you sign first." Adrian tried once more. "This is madness. A maid before the family name?" "No," said Beatrice, and her voice rang clearer than it had all day. "Truth before vanity." That ended it. The pages were turned back, the lamp was brought closer. Dalia stood at the table with every eye on her and the pen resting across her fingers like a weight she had been walking toward her whole life without knowing it. She looked once at Claire's witness note, once at the line written for her, and then she signed. Not grandly, not trembling, just a clean, steady hand. Foreign Accounts and Language Oversight Witness. After that, Beatrice signed. Then Edmund. The silver-haired principal, the legal advisor, Lena, and finally Sebastian in his bounded role, below his aunt and below the woman he had laughed at before breakfast. When the last stroke of ink dried, the silver-haired principal pressed the consortium seal into wax under full witness, and this time everyone in the room saw exactly where it landed. The legal advisor stood back first. The agreement is valid. Lena exhaled. Owen sat down abruptly as if his knees had given out all at once. Mrs. Fenn covered her mouth with her hand and let herself cry for exactly 2 seconds before recovering her dignity. Beatrice closed her eyes and smiled in that quiet, astonished way people smile when disaster passes so close they can still feel its sleeve brushing them. Thomas and the footman moved at Edmund's nod. Adrian and Martin Voss were taken from the room with no more speeches left to spend. Adrian tried one final look over his shoulder, the kind meant to suggest this was not over, but the power had gone out of it. He had been beaten by the very thing he never thought worth counting, a woman who actually read what was in front of her. When the doors shut behind them, the room changed all at once. The strain broke. People breathed again. Sebastian crossed to Dalia slowly, not as heir to servant, not even as family to employee, but as one human being finally stripped of excuses. "I mocked you in front of the whole house," he said. "I mistook silence for emptiness, work for lack of intelligence, and birth for proof of worth. I can't take back any of it, but I can say it plainly now. I was wrong." Dalia looked at him for a moment. She gave the smallest nod. No speech, no performance. That was enough. Edmund rose with effort, using the table edge and his cane, and everyone in the room straightened instinctively. "Let the entire household hear this," he said. "From this evening forward, Dalia Novak no longer serves below stairs, unless she chooses to walk there. She takes charge of the estate's foreign accounts, correspondence, and language review under the authority of this signed agreement. Her word on these matters is to be treated as mine." Mrs. Fenn laughed through tears. Owen looked as if someone had told him winter had been canceled. Beatrice reached for Dalia's hand and pressed it once. Later, after the delegates had withdrawn to take supper in calmer voices, after the evidence had been boxed for the village solicitor and the last wet footprints had faded from the terrace stone, Dalia found herself alone for a moment in the estate office. The room smelled of ink, old wood, and rain drying in the window frame. On the desk lay the black notebook, Claire's witness ledger, and the final agreement with its wax seals cooling into shape. Mrs. Fenn came in without knocking and set a small ring of keys beside Dalia's hand. "The foreign files," she said, "and the West cabinet. Took this house long enough to learn where to put them." She left her there. Dalia stood by the desk and looked out through the office window. The orchard rows were darkening into evening, each tree holding a little silver where the rain had not yet fallen off. On the blotter in front of her, her new signature was drying beside the place where Edmund's had nearly been trapped. The same hands that had spent the morning wiping dust from other people's labels had ended the day drawing a line no one in that house would ever again be able to pretend not to read. In the corridor beyond, servants' voices carried low and warm, no longer whispering in fear but telling the story while it was still fresh enough to tremble in the telling. And on the corner of the desk, next to the keys, one drop of sealing wax had fallen and hardened into a small red bead, perfect, final, and impossible to move without breaking it.